My brother stood in the middle of a crowded courtroom, holding my husband by the hand and said, "Pay up or step aside." My parents sat right behind them, demanding I support the baby they engineered behind my back. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled and opened my legal folder. By the time I finished reading a single line of text, they lost all the color in their faces. Before I reveal exactly how I turned their twisted family reunion into a federal crime scene, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe betrayal is a debt that must be collected in full. The heavy oak doors of the family court sealed shut, trapping the humid air inside the room. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, peering over the bench with a look of profound confusion. Divorce proceedings usually follow a predictable rhythm, but mine had derailed the moment Liam walked through the aisle. The man I had shared a home with for 5 years did not sit beside his legal counsel. He stood near the witness stand, his fingers laced tightly with Caleb. Caleb was my younger biological brother. Caleb stood tall, resting a sleeping 3-month-old infant against his chest. He looked down at me from the podium, wearing a tailored suit I had likely paid for. "Pay up or step aside, Victoria," he stated, his voice echoing across the silent room. "You never had time for a family anyway. We deserve to be happy." I kept my posture rigid, staring at the 2 men standing before the judge. In the front row of the gallery, my parents, Richard and Beatrice, nodded in fierce agreement. My mother leaned forward, her pearls catching the fluorescent light. She spoke out of turn, her voice laced with familiar disdain. "You brought this on yourself," Victoria Beatrice announced to the entire court. "You care more about your real estate acquisitions and your medical supply warehouses than your own husband. You are a workaholic." Liam needed warmth. He found it with Caleb. "They have a child now. Do the right thing and sign over half your assets so this baby has a proper life." My parents expected a breakdown. They anticipated the woman who built a corporate empire from scratch would crumble under the weight of public humiliation. They thought bringing a newborn into a courtroom would force me into a swift financial settlement. They demanded 50% of my holdings as alimony to fund a surrogate pregnancy. They had carefully orchestrated while I was securing commercial leases in Tokyo. I did not argue with my mother. I did not hurl insults at my brother or demand an explanation from my husband. I simply smoothed the lapel of my navy blazer and opened the manila folder resting on the defendant table. "You are right, Caleb," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "A child does require substantial financial stability. Raising a baby is an expensive endeavor, especially when you consider the initial cost of the surrogacy clinic." I pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack. I read the 10-digit bank transaction code aloud. I watched Liam shift his weight, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. I recited the exact date and the exact sum of $150,000 wired directly to the fertility center. Liam scoffed, crossing his arms. "That was a private transaction," he fired back, trying to project authority. "I used my own savings to start this family." I looked up, meeting his gaze. "You used an account ending in 482, I stated. Liam's jaw tightened. He assumed I was merely tracking marital funds. He failed to realize I had hired forensic accountants the moment I suspected a discrepancy in our joint tax filings. "That specific routing number does not belong to a private savings account." "Liam," I continued, my voice dropping to a surgical calm, "that routing code is registered to the charitable foundation we established last year. It is a tax-exempt trust designed exclusively to provide housing assistance for disabled combat veterans. You did not use your personal savings. You wired federal charity funds across state lines to purchase a child." The courtroom fell dead silent. Judge Harrison lowered his pen, his eyes snapping toward Liam. The smug satisfaction evaporated from my brother's face. Richard and Beatrice froze in their seats. They thought they were attending a simple civil divorce hearing to extort a wealthy woman. They had no idea I had just introduced the Internal Revenue Service into the equation and triggered a federal embezzlement investigation. The silence following the mention of the federal charity funds hung heavy in the courtroom. Liam blinked rapidly. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wooden edge of the witness stand. He looked down at his tailored shoes, unable to meet the stern gaze of Judge Harrison. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical drone that seemed to amplify the sudden shift in power. The defense attorney realized his client was drowning. He was a high-priced litigator, hired to secure a swift and lucrative settlement. He smoothed his expensive silk tie and stepped out from behind the defense table, eager to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," the attorney began his voice, projecting a forced calm. "My client is not on trial for accounting errors. We are here to dissolve a marriage and ensure the financial security of a newborn child. The plaintiff is attempting to use a simple clerical misallocation to distract this court from her own legal obligations." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick bound document. He approached the bench, handing a copy to the clerk, before turning to face the gallery. My parents sat up straighter in the front row. Richard adjusted his posture, projecting the image of a dignified patriarch. Beatrice offered a soft, practiced sigh of a grandmother burdened by family strife. They were playing their parts, perfectly anticipating an easy victory. The attorney held his copy of the document in the air. "This is a binding surrogacy contract," he stated, pacing slowly across the floor to ensure every person in the room absorbed his words. The total clinical cost was $150,000. But my client did not act alone. He did not orchestrate some grand deception behind his wife's back, as she claims. If you turn to page 42, you will see the signature of Victoria herself, acting as the primary financial guarantor for this exact medical procedure. Caleb shifted the sleeping infant in his arms, offering a smug, satisfied smile. The attorney continued spinning a tale designed to paint me as a bitter, scorned woman. Victoria knew about the child, he argued, gesturing toward me with open palms. She approved the surrogacy. She agreed to fund the expansion of their family. But when the reality of her husband seeking emotional support from her brother became public, she suffered a bout of extreme jealousy. She is now experiencing buyer remorse and attempting to financially starve an innocent infant out of pure spite. We ask the court to enforce the guarantor clause and compel her to release the funds immediately. Judge Harrison flipped through the pages of the contract, his brow furrowing as he located the signature line. It was a digital authorization. A standard electronic signature, stamped with my full legal name and a corresponding date. On the surface, it looked entirely legitimate. It looked like the undeniable proof of my consent. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my character against the accusation of petty jealousy. I did not waste my breath arguing with a man who is paid by the hour to lie. I simply turned my head and looked at the woman sitting quietly beside me at the plaintiff table. Naomi stood up. Naomi is my sister-in-law, married to my oldest brother, David. While the rest of my family obsessed over country club politics and maintaining a facade of old money wealth, Naomi had built a formidable legacy of her own. She is an African-American woman with a brilliant clinical mind. Before joining private practice, she spent a decade as a federal prosecutor, dismantling corrupt financial institutions and sending arrogant executives to prison. She possesses an intimidating physical presence and a gaze that feels like a heavy physical weight. She commands any room she enters without ever needing to raise her voice. Naomi buttoned her dark charcoal suit jacket and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. She did not bother to look at the defense attorney. She treated him like a minor inconvenience, an obstacle she was about to effortlessly remove. She stopped in front of the judge, holding a single sleek tablet in her hand. "Your Honor," Naomi began, her voice rich and steady, resonating with undeniable authority. "We do not dispute the existence of that contract. We do not even dispute that the digital signature matches my client's legal name. Arguing over the visual representation of a typed electronic signature is a waste of judicial resources." The defense attorney offered a confused frown. Caleb lost his smug smile, exchanging a nervous glance with my parents. They expected a chaotic argument over forged handwriting. They anticipated a messy emotional battle where they could continue playing the victims. They did not anticipate a clinical surrender on the visual evidence. Naomi tapped the screen of her tablet, bringing up a complex digital diagram. When a document is executed through a commercial digital platform, she explained, maintaining unyielding eye contact with the judge, it generates a comprehensive forensic audit trail. The platform records the exact timestamp, the browser history, and most importantly, the Internet Protocol address of the device used to authenticate the signature. This data is embedded deep within the metadata of the file. It is immutable. You cannot erase it, and you cannot fake it. She handed a printed version of the cybersecurity report to the court clerk. The clerk passed the dense technical packet up to the bench. If you review page 3 of our forensic analysis, Naomi instructed, you will see the digital footprint of the signature the defense just submitted. The contract was finalized on October 14th of last year at exactly 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Naomi turned slowly on her heels, facing Liam and Caleb. Her gaze swept past them, locking directly onto my parents sitting in the gallery. Richard swallowed hard, his dignified posture cracking under her intense scrutiny. Beatrice gripped the edge of her leather purse, her knuckles turning white. On October 14th of last year, Naomi stated, her voice dropping to a surgical, icy precision, my client was physically located in Tokyo, Japan. She was delivering a keynote address at a global supply chain summit. We have submitted flight records, hotel receipts, and time-stamped video footage of her presentation. The time difference alone makes the logistics highly improbable, but the geographical data makes it a physical impossibility. She could not have executed that digital signature. The defense attorney took a step backward, his confident facade crumbling into raw panic. He looked at Liam, who was now sweating profusely. The litigator realized he had just handed a fabricated document to a sitting judge. But the forensic trail does not end there. Naomi continued pacing deliberately toward the gallery, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Our cybersecurity team traced the exact Internet Protocol address that generated the forged authorization. The signature was not authenticated from a random coffee shop or a public library. The data packets were routed through a private residential network. She stopped pacing. She stood mere feet away from the wooden railing separating the gallery from the court floor. She looked directly down at Richard and Beatrice. The network is registered to a luxury estate in Fairfield, Connecticut. Naomi announced, her voice echoing through the silent room. It is the primary residence of Richard and Beatrice, the same individuals sitting in this courtroom today, demanding financial support for a child they helped purchase with stolen funds. Caleb stumbled backward, almost losing his balance with the infant. He looked at our parents, his eyes wide with terror. His grand plan to humiliate me and steal my wealth was disintegrating in real time. Naomi turned back to the judge, delivering the final crushing blow. Caleb did not just sign a fake name on a piece of paper, Your Honor. He utilized my client personal identification details, logged into a secure financial platform, and bound her to a 6-figure medical debt. Furthermore, he executed this fraud using the private internet network provided by his parents. Richard and Beatrice did not just turn a blind eye to infidelity. They actively provided the digital infrastructure and the physical safe haven required to orchestrate this deception. Judge Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, digesting the sheer scale of the legal violation unfolding in his courtroom. This is no longer a matter of civil fraud or a simple divorce dispute. Naomi concluded, her tone ringing with absolute finality. By conspiring to utilize my client identity across digital channels to secure financial services, Caleb and the homeowners who facilitated his access have crossed a severe legal threshold. We are formally requesting this court suspend the civil proceedings regarding the surrogacy contract. We are transferring this digital evidence directly to the Department of Justice. The actions documented in that forensic report constitute the federal crime of aggravated identity theft. The sharp crack of the judicial gavel echoed through the chamber, signaling a temporary recess. Judge Harrison needed time in his private chambers to review the federal forensic report Naomi had just placed on his desk. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, spilling the tension out into the expansive corridor. I walked alongside Naomi, our heels clicking in a synchronized rhythm against the veined marble floors. We moved toward a quiet alcove near the tall arched windows, intending to review our next sequence of evidence. We did not make it halfway across the hall. A harsh voice called my name, cutting through the ambient murmur of lawyers and clerks. I stopped and turned. Richard and Beatrice were marching toward us. My father moved with the rigid, uncompromising stride of a man who had spent his entire life expecting the world to bow to his surname. He wore a pristine, tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, projecting the manufactured dignity of old money. My mother flanked him, gripping a rare leather handbag as if it were a shield against the consequences of her own actions. They moved with desperate purpose, cornering me against the cool stone wall of the alcove. They did not look like parents seeking a peaceful resolution. They looked like cornered predators, realizing the trap was closing around them. The revelation regarding their home internet network had shattered their illusion of safety inside the courtroom, but in the hallway they attempted to reclaim their dominance. They still believed their social status in Fairfield County provided an impenetrable armor against the law. Richard stopped inches from my face, invading my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "You think you are remarkably clever, Victoria." He hissed, his voice a low, venomous rumble designed to avoid drawing the attention of passing bailiffs. "You think dragging an internet bill into a courtroom is going to save your bank accounts. You are going to march back in there when the judge returns, withdraw those ridiculous fraud allegations, and sign the financial guarantor forms." I maintained steady eye contact. I did not step back. "Why would I do that, Richard?" I asked, my tone reflecting the serene calm of the marble beneath my feet. "Because if you refuse, I will systematically dismantle your entire corporate existence," he threatened, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You run a medical supply chain. You rely on hospital contracts. I play golf every single weekend with the chief procurement officers of the 3 largest healthcare networks on the East Coast. We sit on the same charity boards. We drink scotch in the same private lounges. By tomorrow morning, I can orchestrate a whisper campaign that will paint your enterprise as a liability. I will have your vendor agreements severed. I will bankrupt your company before the fiscal quarter ends." Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She decided to deploy a different weapon, targeting the emotional vulnerabilities she assumed I still possessed. "And I will ruin you in the press," she added, her tone dripping with aristocratic malice. "I will call the society columnists. I will paint you as a barren, bitter workaholic who refused to support her own flesh and blood. The media will feast on the narrative of a wealthy, vindictive aunt who left an innocent newborn child to starve simply because her husband found true love elsewhere. You will become a pariah. No respectable family will ever associate with you again. You will spend the rest of your life isolated and despised." They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of profound entitlement. They had spent decades curating a flawless public image, masking their emotional bankruptcy with country club galas and designer wardrobes. They genuinely believed that the threat of social exile and corporate sabotage would force me to surrender my assets and fund their illegal surrogacy scheme. They expected me to panic. They anticipated tears, apologies, or a frantic negotiation. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not justify my choices or explain the mechanics of the law they had just broken. Arguing with narcissists only validates their delusion of power. Instead, I reached up and calmly adjusted the lapel of my navy blazer, smoothing a minor crease in the fabric. I let their threats hang in the stagnant air, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocating. "You place a profound amount of faith in your social calendar?" Richard, I finally spoke, keeping my voice surgical and devoid of emotion. "You believe your tea times and your private lounges afford you immunity. You think the elite circles of Fairfield County will protect you from a federal indictment?" I unclasped the brass lock of my leather briefcase. I reached inside, bypassing the thick stacks of forensic audits and financial ledgers. I retrieved a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was not a court document. It lacked the sterile formatting of a legal brief. It featured a very specific embossed crest at the top center of the page. The crest belonged to the Wellington Equestrian and Golf Society, the most exclusive private club in the state. It was the epicenter of my parents' social universe, the very foundation of their influence, and the exact location where Richard claimed he would orchestrate my ruin. Membership at Wellington was not merely about leisure. It was the ultimate currency of the Connecticut elite, a closed ecosystem where fortunes were made, political favors were traded, and reputations were cemented. For decades, my father had used his status there to project an aura of untouchable prestige. I extended my hand, offering the printed document to my father. He frowned, looking at the paper with deep suspicion, before snatching it from my grip. Beatrice leaned over his shoulder, adjusting her designer reading glasses, her eyes scanning the text. Richard read the first line, and his rigid posture faltered. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray hue that contrasted sharply with his tailored suit. His hands began to tremble, causing the heavy paper to rustle audibly in the quiet corridor. The manufactured dignity he had worn like a second skin dissolved, revealing the fragile, desperate man underneath. The document was an internal executive memo circulated to the Wellington Board of Directors early this morning. It detailed a major structural shift in the club ownership. Private establishments of that caliber rarely change hands, but when faced with hidden operational debts and aging infrastructure, they quietly seek silent investors. They require capital infusions to maintain their pristine golf courses and lavish dining halls. I had instructed my blind trust to absorb those specific debts. A month ago, I acquired a 51% controlling stake in the Wellington Equestrian and Golf Society. I was no longer just a member of their community. I was the majority owner and the acting chairman of the board. The memo in Richard hands outlined my very first executive directive. It was a targeted administrative action, bypassing any traditional committee votes or drawn-out appeals processes. The text explicitly mandated the immediate and permanent suspension of the memberships belonging to Richard and Beatrice. The stated justification, printed in bold black ink, was not a minor etiquette violation or a dispute over unpaid dues. The memo cited their active implication in an ongoing federal financial fraud investigation, deeming their continued presence a severe liability to the reputation and operational integrity of the establishment. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls, as the reality of the document fractured her carefully curated world. The high society she intended to use as a weapon against me, the network she threatened to deploy to orchestrate my ruin, had just locked its heavy iron doors in her face. The ladies who lunched the charity organizers, the gossip columnists she sought to weaponize, would now treat her like a walking contagion. "You cannot do this," Richard choked out, his voice reduced to a dry, raspy whisper. His confident threats of corporate sabotage evaporated, leaving only naked panic. He was staring at his own social execution. "My entire network is in that club, Victoria. My investors, my partners, my friends. The annual gala is next week. You cannot strip my membership." "I already did," I replied, watching the realization of his total powerlessness settle into his eyes. "You threatened to use your elite connections to destroy my enterprise. So I simply bought the connections. Your access is permanently revoked. Your weekend tea times are canceled. Your private dining tabs are closed. The security guards at the front gate have strict instructions to turn your vehicles away the moment your tires touch the driveway. You no longer possess a social shield, Richard. You are just a man standing in a courthouse hallway, holding a forged document, waiting for the federal government to collect its debt." The bailiff called the courtroom to order as Judge Harrison emerged from his private chambers. He took his seat at the elevated mahogany bench, his expression grim. The digital forensic report Naomi had submitted prior to the recess sat front and center on his desk. The defense attorney representing Liam knew the fabricated signature was a toxic asset. Pressing the issue of the forged guarantor document would result in immediate criminal referrals for his client. He needed to pivot the narrative away from cyber fraud and back toward the emotional theater of family law. He needed to paint Liam as a desperate father rather than a calculating thief. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the gallery clicked shut. Richard and Beatrice slipped into the front row. They no longer carried the arrogant posture of untouchable elites. My father kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his newly suspended country club status. The social execution in the hallway had drained the fight from them, but they remained anchored to their seats, clinging to the fading hope that Liam could extract enough of my wealth to save them from financial ruin. The defense attorney stood up, abandoning the surrogacy contract entirely. "Your Honor," he began his voice, adopting a somber, pleading tone. "We recognize the complexities surrounding the electronic authorization. We are prepared to set that document aside and focus on the immediate pressing reality in this room. There is an infant present today, a child who requires extensive specialized medical attention." Liam took his cue perfectly. He stood near the witness stand holding the baby he shared with my brother. Liam had always been an exceptional actor. When we first met, he was a struggling freelance consultant drowning in student debt. I gave him a corporate title, a secure lifestyle, and access to rooms he could never have entered on his own merit. He survived in my world by weaponizing his boyish charm and feigning vulnerability whenever he found himself outmatched. He deployed that same calculated vulnerability now. Tears welled in Liam's eyes, spilling over his cheeks as he rocked the sleeping infant. "Victoria is a brilliant businesswoman," he stated, his voice shaking with manufactured grief. "She built an empire from the ground up. I admired her for it. But her ambition blinded her to the human cost of her wealth. Our child was born with severe respiratory complications. The neonatal intensive care unit bills are staggering. We need out-of-network pediatric pulmonologists. We require specialized oxygen equipment for the nursery. I am drowning in medical debt, trying to keep this baby breathing while my wife sits on a fortune." He looked directly at the judge, projecting the image of a selfless father pushed to the brink of despair. "I am not asking for her corporate shares, Your Honor. I am asking the court to grant emergency equitable access to her primary contingency trust. State marital law allows for the invasion of separate property if the survival of a dependent child is at risk. She has millions sitting idle in that trust. I just need enough to pay the doctors." The strategy was undeniably clever. The contingency trust was a financial fortress I established a decade ago. It served as a reserve vault to protect the operational liquidity of my medical supply chain against sudden market downturns. It was hermetically sealed, separate property, immune to standard divorce division. But by leveraging the welfare of a sick infant, the defense attorney was attempting to use judicial empathy as a crowbar to pry open the vault. Judge Harrison softened his posture, looking at the crying man and the fragile infant. Family court judges are conditioned to prioritize the welfare of children above corporate asset protection. The emotional manipulation was working. Naomi did not wait for the judge to issue a ruling. She unbuttoned her charcoal suit jacket and picked up a heavy red tabbed binder from our table. She did not express outrage at the blatant lies. She did not argue about state marital law or the definition of separate property. She simply carried the binder to the center of the floor, placing it deliberately on the evidence podium. "We do not deal in emotional hypotheticals, Your Honor." Naomi stated, her voice cutting through the humid courtroom air like a surgical scalpel. "We deal in forensic accounting." She opened the binder. "We are highly sympathetic to the financial burden of neonatal care." Naomi continued, turning to face the defense table. "However, Mr. Liam's assertions regarding his staggering medical debt present a fascinating numerical paradox. If he is truly drowning in hospital invoices, one must wonder why he has not utilized the vast sums of capital he recently extracted from the marital estate." Liam stopped rocking the baby. The manufactured tears on his cheeks dried instantly. He exchanged a panicked, rigid glance with his attorney. Naomi pulled a certified banking ledger from the binder, holding it up for the court to see. "For the past 90 days, my client authorized a standard forensic cross-audit of all joint checking and savings accounts," Naomi explained. "This is a routine procedure in high-asset dissolution cases. The audit matches reported expenditures against actual cash outflows. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Liam initiated an expedited wire transfer from the primary joint savings account. He drained exactly $300,000 in a single transaction. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet. Your Honor, my client had every right to access joint funds to cover the mounting medical costs he just described. That money was utilized for the child. Was it? Naomi countered, her gaze locking onto the attorney with predatory focus. Because a forensic cross-audit traces the destination routing numbers. If the funds were utilized for neonatal intensive care, we would expect to see the capital flow into the accounts of Mount Sinai Hospital or a pediatric respiratory specialist. She pulled a secondary document from the red-tabbed binder. This was not a hospital invoice. It was a corporate registration filing printed on the official letterhead of the Delaware Division of Corporations. The $300,000 did not go to a medical provider. Naomi stated, her tone devoid of any warmth. The capital was routed through a third-party payment processor, a common tactic used to obscure the final destination of a wire transfer. The funds ultimately landed in a commercial holding account attached to a newly formed limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. Judge Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany bench. And who is the registered proprietor of this Delaware entity, counselor? Naomi turned her head, looking directly at the man holding the infant. The sole listed managing director of the LLC is Caleb. She answered the name, echoing sharply off the stone walls. My client brother. Mr. Liam did not pay a single medical bill. He siphoned joint marital assets and funneled the cash directly into a shell company controlled by his affair partner. Caleb's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, trying to shrink behind the wooden barrier of the witness stand. The narrative of the desperate, struggling parents had just evaporated, revealing two opportunists shifting stolen capital across state lines. The defense attorney raised his hands in a frantic gesture of mitigation. Your Honor, establishing a corporate entity is not a crime. My client and his partner are preparing for their future. They are establishing a foundation to generate income for the child. It is a legitimate enterprise. Naomi let out a low, humorless chuckle. It was a terrifying sound coming from a former federal prosecutor. A legitimate enterprise, she repeated, savoring the phrase before delivering the final lethal strike. Let us examine the exact nature of this enterprise. She handed the Delaware Incorporation documents to the court clerk. Please direct your attention to the declared operational mandate of the limited liability company, Naomi instructed the judge. Judge Harrison scanned the paperwork, his eyes widening as he read the registered business classification. Caleb did not register a real estate firm or a standard investment portfolio, Naomi announced, ensuring her voice reached the disgraced parents sitting in the gallery. He registered the entity as a 501c3 tax-exempt charitable organization. The official name on the charter is the LGBTQ Youth Support Organization. The silence in the courtroom grew so dense, it felt difficult to breathe. Liam closed his eyes, a silent admission of total defeat. Caleb stared at the floor, the infant in his arms no longer a prop, but a heavy burden. They did not just hide marital assets, Your Honor, Naomi concluded, closing the red-tabbed binder with a sharp, definitive snap. They stole $300,000 and parked it inside a fabricated charity to avoid taxation. They intended to use the facade of a marginalized youth support group to wash the stolen capital and withdraw it as untaxed administrative salaries. This court no longer has the jurisdiction to untangle this mess. By weaponizing a fraudulent charitable foundation to launder illicit funds, they have crossed out of family court and directly into the crosshairs of the Department of Justice Anti-Money Laundering Act. The revelation regarding the fraudulent Delaware charity left the courtroom suffocating under a thick blanket of tension. Judge Harrison stared at the defense table, his expression hardening into stone. The defense attorney realized his strategy of painting Liam as a desperate father had just detonated in his face. He needed to pivot away from the financial forensic evidence before the judge ordered an immediate recess to contact federal authorities. He needed to reintroduce the emotional narrative to salvage whatever leverage remained. He hastily flipped through his legal notepad, signaling for his next witness. The attorney called Caleb to the stand. My younger brother stood up from the defense table. He carefully transferred the sleeping infant into Liam's waiting arms. Caleb walked towards the witness box with slow, measured steps. He wore a tailored beige suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, projecting an image of fragility. Growing up, Caleb had always utilized his perceived weakness as a weapon. Whenever he failed an exam or wrecked a vehicle, he would lower his head, let his voice tremble, and wait for our parents to shield him from the consequences. He was about to perform the exact same routine under federal oath. The bailiff swore him in. Caleb took his seat, gripping the edges of the wooden enclosure. He looked at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes. The defense attorney approached the podium, adopting a gentle, sympathetic tone. Caleb, the attorney, began his voice soft and accommodating. We have heard a great deal of complex financial terminology today regarding trusts and corporate entities. But I want to strip away the ledgers and talk about the human reality. Why did you and Liam pursue a surrogacy arrangement in the first place? Caleb let out a shaky breath. He looked down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his cuff. Because I had no other choice, he whispered, ensuring his voice caught just enough to sound authentic. 2 years ago, my doctors diagnosed me with a rare genetic infertility syndrome. It is a chromosomal microdeletion. It means I can never father a child naturally. The diagnosis broke me. Liam and I spent months navigating the grief. We realized that in vitro fertilization and a gestational surrogate were our only viable paths to building a family. He paused, wiping a solitary tear from his cheek. The defense attorney nodded encouragingly. And how did you approach the financial burden of this medical reality? The attorney prompted. Caleb shifted his gaze toward me. The sorrow in his eyes morphed into a practiced, injured resentment. The costs were staggering. Caleb stated, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. Fertility clinics, specialized screening, and maternal care run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We turned to the only place we thought we could find support. We turned to my sister. Victoria is a billionaire. She owns an international medical supply chain. She has more wealth than our family could spend in 10 lifetimes. I went to her begging for help. I asked her to support her own blood. He leaned forward, grabbing the microphone. And she refused, he declared, his voice ringing with rehearsed indignation. She told me my personal life was a poor return on investment. She treated her own nephew like a bad business proposal. Liam and I were desperate. We had to scramble to utilize whatever family resources we could access just to ensure our baby had a chance at life. She sits there judging us, but she forced us into a corner out of pure greed. In the front row of the gallery, my mother dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Richard nodded solemnly, trying to validate his son's tragic narrative. Caleb had successfully painted me as a cold, calculating corporate machine, hoarding wealth, while my own family suffered from genetic misfortune. It was a masterful performance designed to invoke judicial pity and excuse their financial crimes as acts of desperate survival. I did not react to his insults. I did not shake my head or glare at him. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the mahogany table. I looked at the digital clock on the courtroom wall, noting the precise time. Then I raised my right index finger and tapped the hardwood surface exactly once. A single sharp knock. Naomi stood up. She bypassed her legal notepad, leaving her hands empty. She walked out from behind our table, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that had already cornered its prey. She stopped a few feet away from the witness stand, tilting her head as she regarded my brother. Mr. Vance, Naomi began, her voice smooth and devoid of any confrontational edge. That was a truly harrowing medical journey you described. A genetic chromosomal disorder is a heavy burden to bear. And you are entirely correct about the economics of the situation. In vitro fertilization and gestational surrogacy are astronomically expensive endeavors. Caleb relaxed his shoulders slightly, mistaking her calm tone for empathy. He offered a slow, affirmative nod. Yes, they are. Naomi took a single step closer. Which brings us to a fascinating logistical puzzle, Mr. Vance. She continued, her tone sharpening by a fraction of a degree. Earlier today, we established that the $300,000 you extracted from the marital estate was securely parked inside a Delaware shell company under the guise of an LGBTQ youth charity. We tracked the routing numbers. The capital never left that specific holding account. Caleb swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his attorney. So Naomi pressed, stepping directly in front of the witness box. If the stolen marital funds were locked inside a fraudulent tax shelter, how exactly did you pay the fertility clinic? How did you settle the invoices for the embryo transfer, the prenatal vitamins, the monthly specialist visits, and the actual hospital delivery? Medical providers do not accept IOUs, and they certainly do not bill shell companies without verifying the tax identification numbers. The defense attorney stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out. Counsel is badgering the witness regarding accounting mechanics that have no bearing on the necessity of the medical care. Overruled Judge Harrison stated instantly, his eyes fixed on Naomi. The court is highly interested in the origin of these payments. You may answer the question, Mr. Vance. Caleb licked his dry lips. His rehearsed confidence began to fracture under the intense scrutiny of the judge and the former federal prosecutor standing before him. "We utilized a family safety net," Caleb stammered, gripping the wooden railing. "I accessed an insurance policy, a comprehensive health plan to cover the maternal care." Naomi smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was a lethal baring of teeth. "An insurance policy," she repeated, savoring the admission. "That is remarkably resourceful of you, Caleb." She turned on her heel and walked briskly back to our table. She picked up a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy black clip. The top page featured the distinct embossed logo of my corporate enterprise, a global medical supply chain and logistics conglomerate. Naomi carried the stack to the evidence podium, setting it down with a heavy thud. "Your Honor," Naomi announced, projecting her voice across the room. "What I hold here is the internal employee healthcare ledger for my client International Supply Chain Corporation. As the founder and chief executive, Victoria provides her senior leadership team with a platinum-tier corporate health insurance plan. It is a self-funded corporate policy designed exclusively for top-level executives." She opened the stack, flipping past the initial summary pages. She retrieved a specific highlighted invoice and handed it to the court clerk. "My client permitted her brother to retain administrative access to the corporate human resources portal. A courtesy extended from a brief period when he served as a low-level consultant for the firm," Naomi explained. "Caleb used that residual access to log into the corporate database. But he did not look for a family safety net. He committed digital forgery." Caleb's face drained of all color. His hands began to shake visibly against the wooden railing. Liam, who was holding the baby at the defense table, stopped breathing entirely. "If you look at line item 412 on that ledger," Naomi instructed the judge, "you will see a newly added employee. The name registered on the corporate insurance roster is Sarah. She is listed as a senior logistics director, operating out of a remote office." Naomi turned her piercing gaze back to Caleb. "Sarah is not a logistics director. She is the woman you hired to carry your child." The gallery fell into a stunned silence. Richard let out a low, horrified gasp. Caleb did not just find a creative way to pay his bills. Naomi continued, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. He illegally added his surrogate to a corporate payroll roster. He fraudulently enrolled a non-employee into a premium corporate health insurance tier. Over the course of 9 months, Caleb routed every single medical invoice for the surrogacy, the fertility clinic, the prenatal care, and the private hospital delivery through my client corporate insurance policy. He drained over $250,000 from a corporate healthcare fund. Judge Harrison stared at the highlighted ledger, his jaw setting into a rigid line. "This is not a story about a desperate father seeking help from his wealthy sister Naomi," concluded, stepping back from the podium. By falsifying employment records to extract 6-figure medical payouts across state lines, Caleb has committed federal healthcare fraud. The federal statutes governing corporate insurance theft carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The moment he added that name to the roster, his attempt to build a family became a suicide pact with the Department of Justice. The devastating reality of the federal healthcare fraud hung in the stagnant air of the courtroom. Caleb stepped down from the witness box, his legs unsteady, his rehearsed victimhood shattered by the weight of a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. He collapsed into his chair at the defense table, burying his face in his hands. The defense attorney did not offer him a single glance of sympathy. A seasoned litigator recognizes when a ship is sinking, and his immediate priority was severing his primary client from the deadweight. Liam was the husband. Liam was the one with a legal claim to my assets. The attorney needed to pivot the narrative away from the stolen corporate insurance and return the focus to the dissolution of the marriage. He needed a distraction powerful enough to blind the judge to the criminal conspiracy they had just uncovered. The attorney adjusted his posture, smoothing his suit jacket as he walked back to the center podium. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a dense, legal manuscript bound in heavy blue cardstock. He dropped it onto the wooden stand with a loud, authoritative thud. "Your Honor!" The attorney began his voice, projecting a renewed, forced confidence. "We have spent the morning untangling complex corporate ledgers and insurance rosters. But we are losing sight of the fundamental reason we are gathered in this family court. We are here to dissolve a union. We are here to ensure an equitable distribution of marital assets according to the law. And to do that, we must address the prenuptial agreement." Judge Harrison looked up from his notes, his expression guarded. "You are challenging a verified prenuptial contract, counselor?" He asked, his tone indicating deep skepticism. "I am not merely challenging it, Your Honor," the attorney replied, standing tall. "I am moving to have it invalidated in its entirety." A ripple of renewed hope surged through the front row of the gallery. Richard and Beatrice sat up straighter, their eyes locking onto the blue binder. They had just watched their son walk into a federal trap, but the mention of breaking the prenuptial agreement reignited their greed. They knew the exact value of my holdings. If Liam could shatter that contract, the resulting financial fallout would generate enough capital to salvage their ruined social standing and pay off their impending mortgage default. The attorney opened the binder, turning to a specific flagged page. When Victoria and Liam entered into this marriage, they signed a standard asset protection contract, he explained, pacing slowly before the bench. The document insulates her $400 million commercial real estate empire. However, contracts are reciprocal instruments. They require mutual adherence to basic marital duties. I direct the court to Section 4, Paragraph B. The clause explicitly mandates the provision of mutual emotional support and the maintenance of a stable domestic environment. Liam took his cue, sitting up straight and adopting a hollow, haunted expression. My client did not seek outside affection out of greed or malice. The attorney argued, his voice dropping to a somber theatrical register. He was starved of basic human connection. Victoria treated her marriage like a corporate acquisition. She worked 80-hour weeks. She prioritized her medical supply warehouses over her own husband. Her profound emotional neglect drove Liam into a deep, clinical depression. He was isolated. He was breaking down. He sought comfort from Caleb, not to humiliate his wife, but because he was desperate for a lifeline. Victoria breached the fundamental terms of the contract long before Liam ever looked elsewhere. Because she violated the emotional support clause, the asset protection is null and void. We demand a 50% equitable division of the real estate portfolio. $200 million. That was their ultimate gambit. They painted my dedication to my enterprise as a marital crime, attempting to monetize their own infidelity. They wanted to punish me for building a legacy while rewarding Liam for his betrayal. My parents nodded along with the attorney, buying into the delusion that a judge would hand over $500 million to a man who had just been implicated in federal charity embezzlement. I sat quietly listening to the litigator weave his narrative of depression and emotional starvation. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I felt the cold clinical satisfaction of a hunter watching prey step willingly onto a landmine. I reached out and picked up the crystal glass resting on the plaintiff table. I took a slow, measured sip of water. I set the glass down, ensuring no condensation marked the mahogany wood. Then I unclasped my leather handbag. I bypassed my phone and my legal notepads, reaching into the side pocket. I withdrew a small, sleek silver USB drive. It was unremarkable in appearance, but it contained the exact mechanism required to end the negotiation permanently. I slid the silver drive across the smooth table until it bumped gently against Naomi's hand. Naomi did not look surprised. We had prepared for this exact moment. She picked up the drive and stood. "Your Honor," Naomi stated, her voice calm and resonant, cutting through the defense attorney's impassioned speech. Opposing counsel paints a tragic portrait of a man driven to the brink of depression. He claims Mr. Liam sought out Caleb for emotional survival. We submit this digital drive into evidence to provide the court with a crystal-clear understanding of their exact coping mechanisms. The defense attorney spun around his face, flushing with sudden panic. "Objection, Your Honor!" he shouted, rushing forward. "This is surprise evidence. We have not been granted the opportunity to review the contents of that drive through proper discovery channels. Furthermore, any audio or video recordings captured without my client's explicit consent violate state wiretapping statutes. It is inadmissible." Naomi did not raise her voice to match his panic. She turned to the judge, projecting absolute legal authority. "The defense is operating under a severe misapprehension regarding privacy laws," Naomi explained, smoothing the front of her charcoal jacket. "The audio files on this drive were not captured via wiretap or hidden surveillance in a private residence. They were extracted directly from the internal diagnostic system of a 2024 Mercedes SUV, the exact vehicle Mr. Liam drives every single day." Liam's face turned the color of ash. He stared at the silver drive in Naomi's hand, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "That vehicle is not registered to Mr. Liam." Naomi continued delivering the legal foundation with surgical precision. "It is a corporate fleet vehicle owned and insured by my client medical supply company. Under the terms of the commercial insurance policy, all fleet vehicles are equipped with an always-on internal dashcam and diagnostic microphone to monitor for liability in the event of an accident." Mr. Liam signed the fleet utilization agreement, acknowledging the presence of the recording equipment when he accepted the keys. There is no expectation of privacy in a commercially monitored company car. The evidence is entirely admissible. Judge Harrison nodded, motioning toward the court clerk. "Hand the drive to the clerk counselor. Let us hear what is on it." The defense attorney collapsed back into his chair, realizing he had no legal ground to stop the playback. The clerk took the silver drive, plugging it into the primary terminal at the front of the room. He routed the audio output through the courtroom overhead speaker system. A brief moment of static hissed through the air, followed by the low, steady hum of a luxury car engine idling. The acoustics were pristine. The hidden microphone captured every breath, every shift of fabric, and every spoken word with terrifying clarity. Liam's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. It did not sound like the voice of a depressed, neglected husband seeking comfort. It sounded cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of empathy. "We cannot wait for the divorce filing," the recorded voice of Liam stated over the speakers. "If she files first, her corporate lawyers will lock down the commercial real estate accounts. We need access to the primary trust before she knows what is happening." Caleb's voice responded, slick and eager. "So we accelerate the timeline. Did you get the prescription?" The sound of a plastic pill bottle rattling filled the courtroom. It was a sharp, distinct noise that caused my mother to gasp aloud in the gallery. "I picked up the refill yesterday," the recorded Liam confirmed. "It is a heavy antipsychotic. Seroquel. The dosage is massive. If we grind 3 of these into her morning green smoothie, she will not even taste the powder." I watched the judge. Judge Harrison froze his pen, hovering over his legal pad. His eyes widened as the reality of the conversation registered in his mind. "How long until it takes effect?" the recorded Caleb asked. "She will start slurring her words by noon." Liam answered, his tone analytical and detached. "By mid-afternoon, she will lose motor function and experience severe paranoid hallucinations. We do it for 4 consecutive days. I will call her primary care physician and report a sudden severe psychotic break. With her high-stress corporate lifestyle, they will immediately assume she snapped under the pressure. Once they place her on a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold, I invoke my right as her spouse to petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. A conservatorship. Caleb repeated the word, tasting like a victory on the recording. Exactly, Liam confirmed. The judge grants me total temporary control over her medical and financial decisions while she is incapacitated. I bypass the trust restrictions, transfer the liquid capital to the offshore accounts, and by the time she wakes up in a psychiatric ward, the real estate empire is empty. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, devastating silence in its wake. The ambient hum of the air conditioning seemed unnaturally loud. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The defense attorney stared at the blank screen on the clerk desk, his jaw hanging open. He had just demanded $200 million for a man who was actively plotting to drug his wife. Richard and Beatrice sat paralyzed in the gallery, their grand dreams of a financial payout turning to dust. They realized their son and son-in-law were not just greedy opportunists. They were calculating predators. I looked across the room at Liam. He was trembling violently, unable to meet my eyes or the gaze of the judge. Naomi stepped forward, breaking the silence. Her voice rang out sharp and unyielding, echoing off the marble walls. As the court just heard, Naomi stated this is no longer a negotiation over a prenuptial agreement or a debate regarding marital emotional neglect. The individuals sitting at the defense table did not just conspire to commit financial fraud. They procured heavy psychiatric medication with the explicit premeditated intent to poison my client, induce a synthetic psychiatric crisis, and seize her corporate assets through a fraudulent conservatorship. She turned to face the judge, her posture rigid with authority. We are officially requesting that this court halt all civil asset division proceedings immediately, Naomi declared. The family court no longer possesses the jurisdiction to handle this level of criminality. We demand the immediate involvement of federal law enforcement. The divorce trial has concluded. You are now presiding over a criminal conspiracy to commit bodily harm and premeditated attempted poisoning. The echoing silence left in the wake of the dashcam recording felt heavy enough to shatter the marble floor. Liam sat frozen at the defense table, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent hue. He stared at the silver digital drive resting on the clerk desk as if it were a live grenade. The reality of his own recorded voice discussing antipsychotic medication and forced psychiatric holds had just dismantled his entire victim narrative. Before Judge Harrison could strike his gavel and suspend the civil proceedings, a sudden harsh noise erupted from the gallery. Richard leaped to his feet. My father's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He gripped the wooden railing separating the spectators from the legal floor, his knuckles stark white against the dark wood. He refused to accept that his chosen son-in-law and his biological son were conspiring criminals. He needed a scapegoat, and he clung to the only modern buzzword he likely skimmed in a country club financial newsletter. "It is a forgery," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "That audio is fabricated. Anyone with a computer can synthesize a voice these days. It is artificial intelligence. She hired someone to clone their voices to frame them because she refuses to share her wealth. You cannot accept that digital garbage as evidence in a court of law." Judge Harrison glared at my father, his expression hardening into judicial steel. "Sit down, sir," the judge warned, his tone leaving zero room for debate. "One more outburst and my bailiffs will escort you to a holding cell for contempt." Richard swallowed hard, his chest heaving, but he slowly sank back onto the wooden bench. Beatrice grabbed his arm, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Their desperation was palpable. The defense attorney, however, recognized that screaming about artificial intelligence without a forensic counter-analysis was legal suicide. He knew the judge was moments away from picking up the phone to summon federal marshals. The attorney needed to manufacture immediate reasonable doubt regarding his client's moral character. He needed to prove Liam and Caleb were capable of altruism, not attempted murder. "Your Honor!" The defense attorney interjected his voice, lacking its previous arrogant swagger. "The plaintiff is attempting to derail a family court proceeding with sensationalized, unverified audio. We request the opportunity to present a character witness." an individual who can attest to the genuine loving nature of my clients and validate the pure intentions behind their surrogacy journey. Judge Harrison leaned back, crossing his arms. You want to call a character witness right now, counselor? Yes, Your Honor, the attorney pleaded, gesturing toward the rear of the courtroom. We have the gestational surrogate waiting outside. She is an anonymous, altruistic volunteer. She stepped forward to carry this child out of pure compassion for a marginalized couple struggling to build a family. Hearing her testimony will provide this court with a clear picture of my client's true character. The judge let out a slow, measured breath. Bring her in, he commanded. The defense attorney nodded, signaling the bailiff stationed near the heavy oak doors. The bailiff opened the doors and stepped into the corridor. A moment later, a woman walked into the courtroom. She wore a modest floral dress and a beige cardigan, projecting the curated image of a humble, selfless volunteer. She kept her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped nervously in front of her as she walked down the central aisle. She was playing the role of the saintly vessel, a woman who asked for nothing but the joy of helping others. She reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor. I looked at her face. I did not feel a surge of anger. I did not feel betrayed. A sharp, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The sound of my laughter cut through the tense atmosphere like a glass shattering. It was loud, unapologetic, and entirely devoid of courtroom decorum. The defense attorney frowned, turning to glare at me. Caleb stiffened in his chair, his eyes widening in sudden raw panic. Liam looked at the woman and then looked at me, the remaining color draining from his face. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. Do you find something amusing about the witness plaintiff? I stood up from the mahogany table, smoothing the front of my navy blazer. I find the defense definition of an anonymous, altruistic volunteer highly entertaining, Your Honor, I replied, my voice echoing crisp and clear. This woman is not a nameless saint who stumbled upon a fertility clinic flyer. I stepped out from behind the table, pointing directly at the woman standing frozen near the gate. Her name is Sarah, I announced, ensuring every syllable carried to the back row of the gallery. She is not a stranger. 5 years ago, she attended my family Thanksgiving dinner. She sat at my parents' dining table, eating roasted turkey and drinking expensive wine. Because 5 years ago, Sarah was Caleb Live and girlfriend. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richard and Beatrice stared at the woman, their jaws hanging slack. They had funded this entire operation, blindly trusting Caleb's narrative. They had no idea the supposed anonymous vessel was the very same woman my brother had dated in his early 20s. Sarah was a woman who always sought a shortcut to a luxurious lifestyle, and it appeared she had finally found one by monetizing her own reproductive system for her ex-boyfriend. The modest, altruistic facade melted off Sarah's face. She stood rigid, her hands dropping to her sides as the reality of her exposure set in. Naomi did not miss a single beat. She stood up, retrieving a thin gray folder from our evidence stack. The lack of anonymity is certainly a breach of standard clinical protocol, Naomi stated, walking briskly toward the center podium. But it is not a crime. What elevates this reunion from a family scandal to a federal felony is the financial architecture supporting it. Naomi opened the gray folder, extracting a certified financial ledger. When a couple engages a legal surrogate, the financial compensation is strictly regulated. Naomi explained, addressing the judge with the steady cadence of a seasoned prosecutor. The funds must flow through an escrow account managed by a licensed legal representative. This ensures all compensation is tracked, documented, and most importantly taxed by the federal government as independent contractor income. She handed the ledger to the court clerk. My client's brother and her husband did not use an escrow account for Sarah compensation, Naomi revealed. They did not want to leave a domestic paper trail. Using the remaining capital they siphoned from the marital estate, Liam and Caleb initiated a direct offshore wire transfer. Naomi turned her head, locking her dark, piercing gaze onto the woman standing near the gate. They routed exactly $100,000 through a commercial bank in the Cayman Islands, Naomi stated, her voice ringing with lethal precision. The funds were then deposited directly into a private checking account, registered to Sarah under a different surname. It was a cash payment executed entirely under the table. No tax forms were filed. No income was declared. The defense attorney gripped the edges of his table, his knuckles turning white. He realized his star character witness was a walking federal indictment. Sarah is not an altruistic volunteer, Naomi concluded, stepping back from the podium. She is an active participant in a coordinated scheme to hide 6 figures of undeclared income from the United States government. She accepted stolen marital funds across international borders and failed to report the revenue. That is the textbook definition of felony tax evasion. Sarah's legs gave out. She stumbled forward, catching herself on the wooden railing of the witness stand. She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with terror, but my brother averted his gaze, staring blankly at the floor. He had used her, and now he was abandoning her. Sarah pulled herself up, relying on the wooden barrier for support. She slowly lowered herself into the witness chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. She thought she was walking into a civil family court to collect a final payout. She thought she was untouchable. Before the bailiff could even step forward to swear her in, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crack. The noise caused everyone in the room to turn. 2 men in sharp, dark suits strode through the entrance. They did not walk with the hesitant pace of legal clerks or the casual stride of spectators. They moved with the rigid, uncompromising authority of federal law enforcement. They bypassed the gallery seating, marching directly down the center aisle. The man in the lead reached inside his suit jacket. He withdrew a leather credential wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold shield. Criminal Investigation Division, Internal Revenue Service. The agent announced, his deep voice commanding absolute silence in the chamber. He stopped directly next to the witness stand, looking down at the trembling woman in the floral dress. He did not ask for permission to speak. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with a red federal seal. Sarah, the agent stated, dropping the paperwork onto the ledge of the witness box right in front of her. You are hereby served with a federal summons regarding unreported offshore income. Furthermore, the Department of the Treasury has executed an immediate administrative freeze on all domestic and international assets registered in your name. Sarah stared at the red seal, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The money she had hidden, the future she thought she had secured, vanished in the span of a single heartbeat. The federal agents did not wait for a dismissal. They handed the frozen asset summons to the trembling woman in the witness box, turned on their heels, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving a suffocating vacuum in their wake. The defense attorney sank into his leather chair, resting his forehead against his palms. He realized he was no longer managing a divorce settlement. He was presiding over a sinking ship. Judge Harrison struck his wooden gavel, attempting to restore order to a room that had descended into a frantic chorus of whispers from the gallery. The sound of the gavel did not silence my father. The public dismantling of his carefully curated legacy was more than his fragile ego could process. Richard stood up from the front row. He did not care about courtroom decorum or the presence of a federal judge. He marched forward, slamming his open palms against the wooden partition that separated the spectators from the legal floor. The sharp crack of flesh against wood echoed like a gunshot. "This is a coordinated witch hunt," Richard roared. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. His entire identity was built on patriarchal dominance. He spent decades dictating the lives of everyone under his roof, expecting unwavering obedience. He could not fathom a reality where his daughter held the executioner's axe. "You are twisting the narrative, Victoria," my father shouted, his voice laced with venomous entitlement. "You promised them a home. You stood in our living room last year and promised you would secure a property in Westport so your husband and your brother could raise this child in a proper environment. You reneged on your word out of petty spite. You forced their hand. They had to be resourceful to find the capital you denied them." He turned his gaze toward the bench, attempting to leverage his manufactured aristocratic authority. "Your honor. This woman is attempting to destroy her own bloodline to protect her stock options," Richard declared, puffing out his chest. She is spinning a web of corporate technicalities to punish her husband for seeking the family she refused to build. I demand you dismiss these ridiculous fraud claims. She needs to honor her initial promise, drop this lawsuit, and settle this dispute privately to protect the dignity of this family. Beatrice stood up beside him, nodding in fierce agreement. She clutched her designer handbag, treating her husband's delusional demands as undeniable legal doctrine. They still believed they were the victims. They genuinely thought screaming about family honor would somehow erase the federal crimes committed by the two men sitting at the defense table. Judge Harrison glared at my father, reaching for his gavel once more. I raised my hand, signaling the judge to pause. I did not want Richard removed from the courtroom. I needed him to stay and witness the exact cost of his blind loyalty. I did not argue with his fabricated story. I did not defend my honor or point out that I never promised to buy a luxury estate for my cheating husband. I stepped away from the plaintiff table and walked toward the court clerk. I handed the clerk a slim, encrypted flash drive and gestured toward the digital projection system mounted on the ceiling. Resourceful is a fascinating choice of words. Richard Third stated, keeping my voice flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. It implies a certain level of ingenuity. It implies they worked hard to secure their future. Let us examine exactly how resourceful your son and your son-in-law truly are. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright rectangular glow against the white presentation screen, positioned behind the witness stand. A dense, multi-page financial document populated the display. It was not a corporate ledger or a medical invoice. It was a binding legal contract, printed with stark black ink and stamped with the unmistakable seal of a private lending institution. Naomi stepped forward, picking up a laser pointer from the table. She directed the red dot toward the bold header at the top of the projected page. What you see on the screen is a commercial promissory note and deed of trust. Naomi explained, her tone shifting into a clinical rhythmic cadence. It is a specific financial instrument commonly referred to as a hard money loan. Traditional banks require rigorous underwriting, extensive credit checks, and verifiable income streams. Hard money lenders bypass all of that. They operate in the shadow banking sector. They offer immediate liquid capital at predatory interest rates, with one single uncompromising requirement. They demand premium physical real estate as collateral. Liam shrank into his chair. He pulled at the collar of his tailored shirt, suddenly struggling to breathe. Caleb looked at his partner, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his features. Caleb had assumed Liam was funding their lavish lifestyle using my money. He had no idea where the capital actually originated. Mr. Liam enjoys the finer things in life. Naomi continued tracing the red laser along the opening paragraphs of the loan agreement. Over the past 12 months, he purchased a designer wardrobe, leased a luxury sports car, and booked multiple first-class international vacations for himself and Caleb. He funded this lifestyle using a sudden influx of $2 million in liquid cash provided by the lender listed on this screen. Richard crossed his arms, jutting his chin forward. Then he took a loan out against his future settlement. Richard argued, his voice dripping with condescension. That is standard practice in a high-net-worth divorce. He leveraged his expected payout. Naomi offered a sharp, humorless smile. You cannot leverage an expected payout with a hard money lender. Richard, they do not deal in hypotheticals. They require tangible brick and mortar equity. And Mr. Liam did not own any real estate in his own name. He signed a prenuptial agreement, relinquishing any claim to my client's commercial properties. He had zero collateral of his own to pledge. She clicked a button on the presentation remote. The screen scrolled rapidly down to the third page of the document, stopping at the collateral assignment clause. The red laser dot circled a specific residential address, typed in bold letters. Richard squinted at the screen. The haughty arrogance drained from his face, leaving a hollow, empty mask. He read the address silently, his lips moving without producing a sound. Beatrice let out a short, high-pitched gasp, dropping her leather handbag onto the floor. Mr. Liam did not use his own assets to secure this $2 million loan, Naomi stated, delivering the facts with brutal precision. He utilized a fabricated legal instrument. He forged a comprehensive power of attorney document naming himself as the primary financial proxy for his in-laws. He then walked into a private lending office and executed a cross-collateralization agreement. He pledged the Fairfield estate as the sole collateral for his hard money loan. He drained $2 million in raw equity directly out of your primary residence. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the mechanical hum of the projector. Richard stared at Liam. The man he had vigorously defended, the man he had chosen over his own daughter, had secretly signed away the roof over his head. Liam had robbed his own allies to fund his infidelity. But a hard money loan is a short-term bridge instrument, Naomi explained, stepping closer to the gallery to ensure my parents heard every single syllable. The terms are ruthless. It requires a massive balloon payment upon maturity. If the borrower misses the deadline, there is no grace period. There is no negotiation. The lender executes an automatic seizure of the collateral. She clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted, displaying a separate document stamped in bright red ink. It was a notice of default. The $2 million balloon payment matured 48 hours ago. Naomi announced, her voice echoing with finality. Mr. Liam ignored the calls from the lender because his accounts were frozen by our forensic audit. He defaulted on the note. I walked forward, stopping right at the wooden partition separating me from my parents. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. The reality of his ruin had finally pierced his armor. I looked at the man who had just demanded I drop my lawsuit to save his reputation. I offered him a slow, serene smile. Your house, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. The lender filed the final paperwork this morning. The Fairfield estate no longer belongs to you. The county sheriff will arrive with the bank representatives to execute the foreclosure eviction at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The locks will be changed. The gates will be chained. You and Beatrice are officially homeless. The stark reality of the foreclosure notice remained projected against the white screen, casting a harsh, pale glow across the courtroom. Richard slumped against the wooden bench of the gallery, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a borrowed costume on a defeated man. Beatrice sat frozen beside him, staring blankly at the floor. The safety net they had spent their entire lives weaving had unraveled in a matter of seconds. Liam watched them break. He realized the wealthy in-laws he had manipulated for support were now destitute. He had cross-collateralized their only asset, and the lender was coming to claim the keys by sunrise. Liam was cornered. His offshore accounts were flagged by the federal government. His corporate health insurance fraud was documented on the public record. His criminal conspiracy to drug me was captured on a digital drive. The defense attorney representing him had physically pushed his chair a few inches away, creating a literal and symbolic barrier between himself and his toxic client. A cornered animal will gnaw off its own limb to escape a trap. Liam, lacking any tangible leverage, shifted his survival instinct toward the one prop remaining in the room. He lunged toward the defense table, snatching the sleeping infant from Caleb's arms. The sudden violent movement startled the child. The baby began to wail, a sharp, piercing cry that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the family court. Caleb recoiled, holding his empty hands up in a defensive gesture. Liam ignored the crying child, holding the infant awkwardly against his chest as he turned to face Judge Harrison. The calculated charm he used to navigate high society had evaporated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his voice cracked with raw, unfiltered panic. I have nothing left, Liam pleaded, stepping toward the bench before the bailiff raised a hand to halt his advance. The money is frozen. The properties are gone. I am facing federal charges because I made desperate mistakes. But I am still a father, Your Honor. I am a father trying to provide for his family. He rocked the screaming baby, his breathing ragged. State law protects the welfare of a minor. Liam argued, citing fragments of legal statutes he likely overheard in the hallway. If the court strips away all marital assets, I demand emergency primary custody. I demand the right to petition the state for immediate child support subsidies, housing assistance, and emergency welfare vouchers. I need the court to issue a mandate protecting my rights as a biological parent. Victoria can keep her corporate empire, but she cannot take my child. This baby is my flesh and blood. He is my legacy. He is the only real thing I have left in this entire nightmare. He stood there, weeping, clutching the infant like a human shield. He weaponized the concept of biological lineage, attempting to force the judge to grant him a lifeline through the state welfare system. He believed that securing custody would insulate him from immediate arrest and guarantee a steady stream of government funding. I sat at the plaintiff table, observing his performance. I watched the tears stream down his face as he desperately claimed ownership over the crying child. I did not object to his plea. I turned my head and offered a slow, deliberate nod to Naomi. I agree with the defendant, Your Honor. I stated, my voice cutting through the sound of the wailing infant. If Mr. Liam is indeed the biological father, he possesses an inherent right to seek emergency state assistance. We should verify his claim immediately, so he can begin the welfare application process without delay. Judge Harrison frowned, looking from me to Naomi. Verification is standard procedure, the judge noted, adjusting his glasses. In any contested dissolution involving demands for financial child support, the state mandates a genetic paternity panel. The court clinic collected the requisite buccal swabs from the plaintiff, the defendant, and the minor child during the initial discovery phase last month. Naomi picked up a thick manila envelope from our evidence stack. It bore the embossed seal of the State Forensic Laboratory. We received the certified genetic profile this morning. Your Honor, Naomi announced, her tone devoid of any sympathy. We withheld it until the financial audits were entered into evidence, but given Mr. Liam's impassioned plea regarding his biological legacy, it seems appropriate to review the findings now. She walked over to the court clerk, handing him the sealed envelope. The clerk broke the tamper-evident tape and extracted a single sheet of clinical paper. He placed it directly onto the glass plate of the projector, replacing the foreclosure notice. The courtroom display shifted. The screen illuminated a dense grid of genetic markers, alphanumeric codes, and chromosomal comparisons. Liam stopped rocking the baby. His tear-streaked face turned toward the bright screen, a sudden flicker of unease breaking through his desperate facade. Naomi retrieved her laser pointer. She did not bother explaining the complex genomic sequencing at the top of the page. She dragged the red dot directly to the bottom right corner of the document, hovering over a bolded summary line. A standard paternity test analyzes specific genetic loci to establish a biological link, Naomi explained to the silent room. The state requires a match probability of 99% to confirm legal paternity for the purpose of the state subsidies and child support. I direct the attention of the court to the final calculation on the official forensic report. The red dot circled the number. Probability of paternity. Naomi read aloud, her voice echoing off the stone walls. 0%. Liam's jaw dropped. He stared at the zero. The infant in his arms continued to cry, but Liam seemed to forget the child was even there. He shook his head, taking a slow, staggering step backward. That is a clerical error, Liam stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The clinic made a mistake. They mislabeled the swabs. I signed the intake forms at the fertility center. They used my genetic sample. The forensic laboratory does not make clerical errors with chain of custody evidence, Naomi countered smoothly. The genetic profile is accurate, and it aligns perfectly with your historical medical records. She picked up a secondary file from our table. When Caleb fraudulently enrolled the surrogate into my client corporate health insurance policy, he inadvertently granted our forensic team administrative access to the associated medical claims, Naomi revealed. That access included the pre-screening fertility evaluations for both prospective fathers. She tossed the file onto the defense table. It landed with a sharp slap right in front of Caleb. According to the endocrine panels and the urology reports filed 6 months ago, Mr. Liam suffers from a severe physiological condition, Naomi stated, delivering the diagnosis with clinical detachment. He is medically sterile. Natural reproduction and assisted in vitro fertilization, utilizing his genetic material, are both biological impossibilities. Liam stopped breathing. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an explanation. He looked at the medical file on the table, and then he looked at Caleb. My younger brother shrank into his expensive beige suit. Caleb pressed his spine against the back of his chair, unable to meet Liam's gaze. His hands trembled as he stared down at the polished wood of the defense table. He knew, Naomi said, pointing her laser pointer directly at Caleb. Your affair partner reviewed the fertility screening results. He knew you were sterile, Liam. But he also knew that if he told you the truth, you might abandon the surrogacy project. If the project died, his access to my client bank accounts would die with it. Caleb needed you to remain invested in the illusion of building a family. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Liam's mind. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. Caleb orchestrated the entire procedure behind your back. Naomi continued dissecting the betrayal with surgical precision. He contracted Sarah, his former girlfriend. He utilized an anonymous donor sample from a commercial cryobank to fertilize her eggs. He then forged your signature on the clinical intake forms, listing you as the biological sire to keep you compliant. Liam stood frozen in the center of the courtroom. The crying baby in his arms was not his legacy. It was not his flesh and blood. It was a biological stranger, procured through a commercial transaction. He had destroyed his marriage to a billionaire. He had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from a federal charity. He had forged a power of attorney and signed away his in-laws' luxury estate. He had conspired to drug his own wife with antipsychotic medication. He was staring down the barrel of a decade in a federal penitentiary. He had committed every single one of those atrocities under the belief that he was securing a future for his own child. He slowly lowered his gaze, looking at the man sitting at the defense table. Caleb did not love him. Caleb had never viewed him as a partner or a co-parent. Caleb viewed him as a gullible, easily manipulated human lockpick, a convenient tool designed exclusively to pry open the vault of my corporate empire. Liam had sacrificed his freedom, his reputation, and his entire life to fund a counterfeit family engineered by a parasite. The realization fractured his mind, leaving nothing but a dark, terrifying void where his future used to be. The stark zero projected on the courtroom display severed the final thread of Liam's fabricated reality. He stood rigid in the center of the floor, holding a wailing infant that possessed no biological tie to his lineage. The child was merely a prop, purchased with stolen funds to secure an emotional ransom. He looked at Caleb sitting frozen at the defense table. My brother had orchestrated this entire deception, allowing Liam to drain his own marital assets, sign away his in-laws' luxury estate, and risk federal prison, all under the guise of building a family. Caleb had used him as a disposable human shield. Liam did not carefully hand the crying baby back to the clerk. He shoved the infant directly into the chest of his bewildered defense attorney. The seasoned litigator stumbled backward, catching the child as Liam pivoted on his heel. The calculated charm, the boyish vulnerability, and the manufactured grief evaporated in an instant. Liam surrendered to raw, feral rage. He vaulted across the polished mahogany defense table. The heavy wooden chairs splintered against the hardwood floor as Liam crashed directly into Caleb. The impact sent both men tumbling backward, slamming violently against the wooden partition, separating the court floor from the gallery. Richard and Beatrice shrieked, scrambling out of the front row to avoid the collapsing furniture. Liam pinned my brother against the railing, wrapping both hands tightly around Caleb's throat. His knuckles turned a stark bone white as he squeezed. Caleb gasped his face, rapidly turning a mottled purple hue. His manicured hands clawed uselessly at Liam's wrists, tearing at the tailored fabric of his suit jacket. "You used me!" Liam roared, his voice tearing through the courtroom. Saliva flew from his lips as he shook Caleb, crushing his head against the wooden barrier. "I gave you everything. I stole for you. I forged the documents for you. I risked my entire life for you." Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly against the bench, shouting for order. 3 armed court bailiffs rushed across the floor, their heavy boots pounding against the marble. They converged on the struggling men, grabbing Liam by the shoulders and attempting to pry his fingers apart. The physical lock was fueled by pure adrenaline. It took the combined strength of 3 trained officers to break his grip. They hauled Liam backward, wrestling him to the ground and pinning his arms firmly behind his back. Caleb collapsed onto the floor, gasping for oxygen, his hands clutching his bruised neck. He coughed uncontrollably, retreating into the corner like a wounded animal. Liam thrashed against the uniform officers, fighting the restraint. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and erratic. Recognizing that physical violence was no longer an option, he weaponized his fury, directing it at the gasping man on the floor. In his desperate need to inflict pain on the man who had betrayed him, Liam abandoned every shred of legal self-preservation. He forgot about the judge, the federal agents, and the recording devices. He only wanted Caleb to suffer. "I married her for us," Liam screamed, his voice cracking, echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "I endured this entire charade for you. You promised me we would leave the country together as soon as my citizenship cleared. You told me the marriage was just temporary paperwork to secure my status. Now my visa is expiring. If she divorces me, they will deport me. I did all of this to stay here. You ruined my only chance. Give me my money." The frantic confession hung in the stagnant air. The bailiffs pulled Liam upright, keeping his hands restrained behind his back. Richard and Beatrice stood trembling near the courtroom doors, clutching each other in horrified silence. They had spent years boasting to their country club peers about their brilliant, successful son-in-law. They had weaponized his status against me, demanding I fund his lifestyle to protect the family honor. They were now watching their pristine, high-society narrative dissolve into a cheap, desperate scheme. Their prized son-in-law was not a Wall Street prodigy or a devoted family man. He was a foreign grifter, running a green card scam with their biological son. Naomi did not call for order. She did not interrupt the chaotic aftermath of the physical altercation. She allowed the silence to settle over the room, giving Liam confession the time and space to fully marinate in the minds of everyone present. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, picking up a distinct manila folder from the bottom of our evidence stack. The folder did not bear the emblem of a financial institution or a state medical laboratory. It featured the heavy, watermarked seal of the Department of Homeland Security. "Thank you for the verbal confirmation," Mr. Liam Naomi stated, her voice returning to its surgical, even cadence. Forensic accounting and digital tracking often require weeks of tedious verification. A spontaneous public confession under federal oath significantly expedites the administrative process. Naomi walked slowly toward the center podium. The defense attorney, still holding the crying infant, stared at her in defeated silence. He made no move to object. There is no legal defense for a client who confesses to federal fraud in open court. Entering into a marital union with a United States citizen for the primary purpose of evading immigration laws is a direct violation of federal statute, Naomi explained, addressing the judge while keeping her piercing gaze locked on Liam. It is commonly referred to as marriage fraud. However, the specific operational scope of this deception elevates the charges considerably. She opened the heavy folder, retrieving a document stamped with official government tracking codes. My client filed the initial immigration sponsorship paperwork. In good faith, Naomi continued handing the document to the court clerk. She submitted an I-130 petition for an alien relative believing the union was genuine and legally sound. But the internal digital communications we extracted from the corporate Dashcam and the company servers paint a remarkably different operational timeline. Naomi turned to face Liam. He had stopped fighting the bailiffs. The adrenaline was fading rapidly, replaced by a cold, creeping terror as he stared at the watermarked folder. You and Caleb maintained a continuous romantic and financial partnership for the entire 5-year duration of this marriage. Naomi stated, her tone devoid of any empathy. You conspired to siphon marital assets. You engineered a fraudulent charity to launder stolen capital. You forged a power of attorney to execute a hard money loan against a private estate. And as you just admitted on the public record, you utilized my client solely as a biological anchor to secure your permanent resident status. You treated a federal immigration process as a convenient financial vehicle. Judge Harrison rested his chin on his steepled fingers, digesting the sheer magnitude of the criminal web unfolding in his jurisdiction. Counsel, the judge, prompted his voice, low and serious. What is the current status of the defendant immigration petition? Naomi offered a sharp, humorless smile. The Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate takes a rather unforgiving stance on individuals who weaponize the institution of marriage to bypass federal border controls, Naomi answered. Our legal team submitted the financial audit, the forged digital signatures, and the encrypted communications to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services Field Office yesterday morning. They expedited the review process based on the presence of the active federal embezzlement charges and the pending healthcare fraud indictment. Liam's legs began to shake. The bailiffs tightened their grip, ensuring he did not collapse onto the marble floor. He had spent 5 years carefully curating his existence, relying on his charm and his tailored suits to mask his true intentions. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he could steal a fortune and secure a passport in one seamless maneuver. Naomi checked the silver watch on her wrist, verifying the precise time. The administrative judge at the Immigration Directorate reviewed the digital evidence and signed the mandate early this morning. Naomi announced delivering the final lethal blow. Your permanent resident status is no longer pending review, Mr. Liam. It is not under investigation. It is officially and permanently revoked. The green card sitting in your leather wallet is now a worthless piece of plastic. By violating the core statutes of the Federal Immigration Code, you have forfeited your right to remain in this country. You are currently standing in a court of law as an undocumented illegal alien. Judge Harrison recessed the court for a mandatory 90-minute lunch period, instructing federal marshals to secure Liam pending an immediate transfer to an immigration detention facility. The chaotic energy of the morning session faded as Naomi and I retreated to a private VIP waiting room reserved for high-profile litigants. The space was a sterile sanctuary of polished concrete and soundproof glass, shielding us from the frantic reporters already gathering on the courthouse steps. I sat on a low leather sofa, sipping chilled, sparkling water, while Naomi organized her digital evidence files on an encrypted workstation. The morning had been a surgical dismantling of my husband, but the true architect of the betrayal was still breathing free air. Caleb had watched his partner collapse under federal charges. He knew his own indictment was imminent. A cornered predator with no remaining escape routes will always resort to a final desperate strike. My smartphone vibrated against the glass coffee table, disrupting the quiet room. A single encrypted message notification illuminated the screen. The sender identification displayed a private numerical relay, but I recognized the digital signature immediately. It was Caleb. He was likely hiding in a downstairs restroom or a vacant stairwell separated from his disgraced partner and his horrified parents. He had realized that crying on the witness stand and playing the genetic victim would not save him from a decade in federal prison. He needed an exit strategy. He needed untraceable capital to flee the jurisdiction before the Department of Justice finalized his arrest warrant. I unlocked the device and opened the message thread. There was no desperate plea for forgiveness. There was no attempt to justify his actions. The screen displayed a heavy, high-definition video file accompanied by a single line of text. I tapped the screen to initiate the playback. The video filled my display, casting a harsh synthetic light across my face. The footage appeared to originate from a hidden nursery camera. It depicted a woman standing over a designer crib. The woman wore my exact navy blazer. She possessed my exact facial structure, my precise hairstyle, and my distinct posture. The figure in the video reached into the crib, grabbing the infant we had seen in the courtroom just an hour prior. The digital version of me shook the child with terrifying force, screaming a string of vicious profanities directly into the face of the crying baby. The audio matched the specific cadence and pitch of my voice with chilling accuracy. To an untrained eye, scrolling through a social media feed, it looked like undeniable high-definition proof of severe child abuse. I did not drop the phone. I did not gasp or feel a surge of panic. I watched the video a second time, analyzing the visual data with clinical detachment. The shadows cast by the crib bars did not bend correctly across the fabric of the blazer. The frame rate stuttered for a fraction of a millisecond when the synthetic figure turned her head, exposing a minor pixelation error along the jawline. The audio track lacked the natural ambient reverberation of a confined nursery. It was a deepfake, a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence composite designed to weaponize public outrage. I scrolled down to read the text message Caleb had attached to the file. Transfer $5 million into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet by 1 o'clock, the message demanded. If the funds do not clear, I will send this file to every major news outlet and social media aggregator in the country. Your shareholders will panic. The public will demand your resignation. The board of directors will force you out to save the corporate reputation. Your stock price will hit zero before the market closes. Pay the ransom or watch your empire burn. Caleb fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of power. He assumed I governed my enterprise through the fragile lens of public relations. He believed that the threat of a viral scandal would paralyze my logic and force me to capitulate. He relied on the modern culture of immediate internet condemnation to act as his personal extortion tool. He thought he held a digital guillotine over my head. I did not reply to the message. Engaging with a blackmailer validates their perceived leverage. I tapped a single button on my screen, forwarding the entire encrypted data packet directly to Naomi, workstation across the room. We have a hostage situation. I announced, my voice calm and devoid of any emotional urgency. A digital one. Caleb is requesting a $5 million severance package in exchange for keeping a synthetic media file off the internet. Naomi stopped typing. She opened the incoming file on her dual monitor setup, maximizing the video to fill the high-resolution screens. She watched the fabricated abuse footage, her expression hardening into a mask of pure prosecutorial focus. She did not express outrage at the graphic nature of the video. She recognized it instantly for what it was. It was a digital fingerprint left behind by a careless criminal. He is getting sloppy. Naomi noted her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. Desperation breeds technical errors. Generating a deepfake of this caliber is not a simple task you can execute on a standard commercial laptop. The neural network algorithms require massive computational resources. Rendering high-definition synthetic media demands high-end graphical processing units and significant server bandwidth. He could not have rendered this file on his personal device while sitting in a courthouse hallway. He had to outsource the processing power. She opened a secure communication channel to our corporate cybersecurity division, headquartered in Seattle. Naomi uploaded the video file into a specialized forensic diagnostic program designed to strip away the visual layer and expose the foundational code. When an individual creates and exports a digital file, the rendering software embeds a trail of metadata. It acts as a digital birth certificate, recording the exact time, the specific software version, and the Internet Protocol address of the machine that compiled the final product. We waited in the silent VIP room. The digital clock on the wall ticked forward. Caleb was likely staring at his phone, sweating, waiting for the incoming transfer notification that would never arrive. 3 minutes later, a green notification flashed across Naomi's screen. The Seattle cybersecurity team had successfully cracked the metadata encryption. Naomi opened the raw data log, scanning the lines of code with practiced efficiency. A slow, lethal smile spread across her face. I found his rendering farm, Naomi announced, pivoting her monitor so I could see the highlighted text. I looked at the specific Internet Protocol address, listed in the origin data. It was not a hidden dark web server. It was not a rented cloud computing cluster based in a foreign country. The IP address mapped directly to a registered commercial domain. He used the Vance Global Imports internal network, Naomi stated, delivering the revelation with surgical precision. Vance Global Imports was the crown jewel of my father legacy. Richard had inherited the logistics and shipping firm decades ago. It was a heavily regulated legacy enterprise that held lucrative federal contracts for importing industrial materials. The company provided the vast cash flow that funded their Fairfield estate, their country club memberships, and their illusion of aristocratic superiority. The corporate headquarters housed a massive dedicated server room to manage international shipping manifests and customs databases. Caleb needed raw computing power to render his extortion video. He retained legacy administrative access to his father's corporate network from a brief stint serving as a nominal vice president of logistics. He had logged into the Vance Global Imports mainframe, bypassing their firewall, and hijacked their commercial servers to process his synthetic deepfake. Naomi stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her charcoal suit jacket. Caleb just made a fatal jurisdictional error. She explained, her voice ringing with the undeniable authority of a former federal prosecutor. Transmitting a threat across state lines with the intent to extort $5 million constitutes federal cyber blackmail. It is a severe felony on its own. But the infrastructure he chose to utilize changes the entire legal landscape of this trial. She picked up her tablet, syncing the forensic report to the presentation drive we would use in the afternoon session. By executing a digital extortion scheme through the central servers of a legitimate corporate entity, Caleb has formally weaponized the business. Naomi continued. Under the statutes of the Department of Justice, this action transforms Vance Global Imports from a standard commercial enterprise into a host network for organized crime. He used a registered corporate entity to conduct illicit racketeering activities. I looked at the digital clock. It was time to return to the courtroom. My parents had spent the entire morning defending Caleb, claiming he was merely a victim of my corporate greed. They had demanded I protect the family honor. They had no idea their golden child had just infected their only remaining source of wealth with a lethal legal virus. This triggers the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, I stated, acknowledging the ultimate legal consequence. The RICO statute. Exactly, Naomi confirmed, picking up her heavy red evidence binder. Because Richard and Beatrice are the sole proprietors and registered owners of the network used to commit federal extortion, they are now legally classified as accomplices to a criminal syndicate. The government does not issue fines for RICO violations. They execute total asset forfeiture. Caleb just handed the Department of Justice the legal authority to seize and liquidate your father's entire company. I smoothed the lapel of my blazer, feeling a profound sense of closure. My parents had threatened to use their elite connections to destroy my enterprise. Instead, their favored son had just utilized their own corporate servers to sign their ultimate death warrant. We walked out of the VIP room, heading back to the courtroom to deliver the final execution. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, marking the beginning of the afternoon session. The atmosphere inside the chamber had shifted from tense anticipation to a suffocating dread. Liam sat at the defense table, but he was no longer an autonomous citizen. Two armed federal marshals stood directly behind his chair, their presence a stark reminder that his immigration status was officially revoked. His tailored suit looked rumpled. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his impending deportation. Caleb sat next to him, glancing nervously at the digital clock on the wall. The deadline for his $5 million extortion demand had passed 20 minutes ago. He was waiting for the financial notification that would allow him to flee, but his phone remained silent. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented during the morning session, Richard and Beatrice returned to the gallery with renewed arrogance. My father sat with his legs crossed, his chin tilted upward in a display of manufactured confidence. Beatrice smoothed her designer skirt, offering Caleb a subtle, encouraging nod. They did not look like parents facing imminent homelessness or federal racketeering investigations. They looked like investors waiting for a highly anticipated stock market correction. They had spent the lunch hour coordinating a final desperate offensive, relying on the only weapon they truly understood. They were weaponizing public perception. The defense attorney stood up from his table. He looked exhausted, holding his digital tablet with a white-knuckled grip. He knew his clients were facing federal prison, but his retainer required him to fight for the Civil Asset Division until the judge officially dismissed the case. He cleared his throat, stepping toward the center podium. Your Honor, the defense attorney began his voice, projecting a forced sense of urgency. We spent the morning reviewing corporate logistics and immigration statutes, but we must return to the core issue of the marital estate and its current valuation. My client has a vested interest in the financial health of the plaintiff enterprise. And right now, that enterprise is bleeding value by the minute. Judge Harrison looked down from the bench, his brow furrowing. What exactly are you claiming, counselor? The defense attorney tapped the screen of his tablet, holding it up for the court to see. I am claiming that a protracted public divorce is destroying the market capitalization of the plaintiff company, he argued. 20 minutes ago, a major digital media outlet published an extensive investigative piece detailing the severe psychological abuse my client suffered during this marriage. The article paints the plaintiff as a cold, calculating executive who subjects her family to extreme emotional cruelty. Richard smiled, leaning back in his wooden pew. This was his strategy. He and Caleb had hired a crisis public relations firm to leak a fabricated narrative to the press. They believed that exposing me to public scrutiny would trigger a shareholder panic. They assumed the board of directors would demand a swift, quiet settlement to protect the corporate brand. They thought I would hand over millions of dollars just to silence the tabloid headlines. The article is currently trending across all major social media platforms. The defense attorney continued his voice, gaining a fraction of its former swagger. The public backlash will be immediate and severe. If this trial continues, the negative publicity will tank the corporate stock. We propose an immediate, equitable settlement to halt the litigation and allow both parties to issue a joint statement mitigating the public relations disaster. The attorney was offering a thinly veiled threat disguised as a compromise. Pay us the money, and we will call off the media attack. Liam looked up, a glimmer of hope returning to his hollow eyes. He thought he had found a loophole. He thought public shame was the one currency that could force me to yield. I sat at the plaintiff table, my posture relaxed. I did not reach for my phone to check the stock ticker. I did not whisper frantically to my legal counsel. I simply looked at Naomi and offered a slow, deliberate nod. Naomi stood up, her charcoal suit jacket, crisp and immaculate. She walked toward this court clerk, pointing toward the digital projection system mounted on the ceiling. Public perception is indeed a volatile asset, Your Honor. Naomi stated, her voice echoing with surgical calm. Since opposing counsel is so deeply concerned about the immediate impact of this specific article, we should review it together. It is only fair that the court reads the exact allegations being levied against my client. She turned to the defense attorney, extending her hand. Please, counselor, cast your tablet screen to the courtroom projector. Let everyone read the headline. The defense attorney hesitated for a fraction of a second, sensing a trap, but the arrogance of his clients pushed him forward. He tapped a sequence on his screen, linking his device to the overhead system. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright rectangular glow against the white wall behind the witness stand. Richard sat forward, eager to see his daughter publicly humiliated on a 10-foot display. Beatrice adjusted her glasses, preparing to relish the fabricated scandal. The screen illuminated, but it did not display a sensational headline or a glossy tabloid photograph. It did not feature an exposé about a cruel female executive. The display showed a stark white page with bold black text centered perfectly in the middle of the screen. Error 404, domain suspended. The defense attorney frowned, tapping his screen repeatedly. He refreshed the browser. He opened a new tab and typed the web address manually. The result remained identical. The website was gone. The article did not exist. The entire digital publication had been wiped from the internet. The server must be down. The attorney stammered, his confident facade fracturing. The traffic likely crashed their hosting site. Naomi let out a low, resonant laugh that chilled the room. The server did not crash, counselor, she corrected, stepping directly in front of the projector screen. The domain was suspended because the publisher issued an immediate administrative takedown order. She walked back to our evidence table, retrieving a thick-bound legal folio. She handed the folio to the court clerk, instructing him to pass it up to the judge. My client does not govern her enterprise through the fragile lens of public relations, Naomi explained, her voice cutting through the humid air. She governs through acquisitions. 3 months ago, her blind trust executed a hostile takeover of the media conglomerate that operates that specific digital tabloid. She recognized the publication as a strategic asset for corporate messaging. My client owns the hosting servers. My client employs the editorial board. She is the sole proprietary publisher of the outlet you just attempted to weaponize. Caleb dropped his phone onto the defense table. The device clattered against the wood, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet chamber. His deepfake extortion had failed. His public relations smear campaign had evaporated. He had inadvertently pitched a hit piece to a newsroom entirely controlled by his target. But owning the publication is merely a structural advantage. Naomi continued retrieving a secondary document from her briefcase. The true issue here is the methodology your clients utilized to bypass the standard editorial review process. She held up a single sheet of paper stamped with the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Journalists require verified sources to publish allegations of abuse, Naomi stated, pacing slowly across the floor. They require police reports or sworn affidavits. Your clients possessed neither. To guarantee the immediate publication of that article while this court was in session, they bypassed journalistic integrity entirely. She turned her piercing gaze toward Liam, who was now shrinking back in his chair, flanked by the federal marshals. An hour ago, the editor-in-chief of that tabloid walked into a federal field office in Lower Manhattan. Naomi announced, delivering the facts with brutal, unyielding precision. He did not go there to report a server outage. He went there to surrender physical evidence and provide a sworn statement to federal agents. Richard gripped the wooden pew, his knuckles turning white. His grand strategy was collapsing into a federal nightmare. Yesterday evening, a crisis management agent hired by Mr. Liam and Mr. Vance met the editor in a private parking garage, Naomi revealed. The agent handed the editor a leather briefcase containing $50,000 in untraceable cash. It was a direct bribe to publish a fabricated article designed to influence the outcome of an active judicial proceeding and force a financial settlement. The defense attorney took a slow, staggering step backward. He looked at Liam with raw, undisguised horror. He realized his client had just used him to introduce the results of a federal crime into the court record. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked down at Liam, the full weight of judicial fury radiating from the bench. Naomi delivered the final fatal strike. Paying a media entity to manipulate public perception is an ethical violation. But paying a publisher $50,000 in physical cash to extort a plaintiff during an active federal investigation crosses into a distinct category of criminal law. The Department of Justice has formally drafted the secondary indictment. By orchestrating that cash bribe, Mr. Liam and Caleb have committed felony witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and criminal defamation. Liam closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his pale cheek. The media campaign he thought would save him had just sealed his tomb. The trap was sprung, the exits were locked, and the executioner had not even raised her voice. The defense attorney stood behind his table, surveying the wreckage of his legal strategy. His leather briefcase was entirely empty. He had no remaining forensic reports to challenge the financial audits. He had no character witnesses left to call because his final volunteer was currently freezing her offshore assets under the supervision of the Internal Revenue Service. Every single piece of evidence he had introduced throughout the day had detonated upon impact, transforming his clients from aggrieved victims into federal suspects. He looked at Liam, who was slouched in his chair, flanked by two silent federal marshals. He looked at Caleb, who was staring blankly at the polished mahogany wood, his extortion scheme reduced to a catastrophic racketeering violation. The attorney knew he could not argue the facts. The facts were a labyrinth of fraud, embezzlement, and digital forgery. He needed to abandon logic and rely entirely on judicial empathy. He needed to deliver a closing argument that ignored the towering mountain of federal felonies and focused solely on the fragile emotional core of family law. He walked slowly toward the center podium, resting his hands on the edges of the wooden stand. He lowered his head, adopting a posture of profound humility. "Your Honor." The defense attorney began his voice, a quiet, gravelly whisper designed to draw the listener in. "We have spent hours dissecting ledgers, routing numbers, and corporate metadata. We have witnessed my clients make terrible, desperate mistakes. I am not standing here attempting to justify the falsified insurance rosters or the offshore wire transfers. Those actions carry consequences that Mr. Liam and Mr. Caleb will have to face in due time. He paused, turning slightly to gesture toward the infant, still resting awkwardly in the arms of the court clerk. But I am asking this court to look past the financial mechanics and see the human collateral the attorney pleaded. There is an innocent child in this room. A child who holds no blame for the tangled web of his father's choices. If you strip away every asset, if you deny my client any fraction of the marital estate, you are not just punishing two flawed men. You are punishing a newborn baby. You are sending an infant out into the world with zero financial stability, no housing, and no medical safety net. In the front row of the gallery, my parents leaned forward. Richard gripped the back of the wooden pew in front of him, his knuckles stark white against the dark grain. Beatrice pressed her hands together, holding them tight against her chest. Her lips moved in a silent, frantic prayer. They did not care about the welfare of the child. They cared about the math. If the defense attorney could squeeze even 5% out of a $400 million commercial real estate portfolio, it would yield $20 million. It would be enough capital to pay off the predatory hard money lender, save the Fairfield estate, and rescue their elite social standing before the sheriff arrived with the eviction notice tomorrow morning. They were begging the universe for a crumb of the settlement. I implore the court to exercise its unique power of equity, the defense attorney concluded, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Look past the corporate statutes. Show mercy to the child. Grant my client a minor stipend, a modest trust, restricted exclusively for the housing and medical needs of the infant. Allow them a fraction of the estate to ensure this baby does not become a ward of the state. The attorney stepped back from the podium, lowering his head. He had played his final card. The courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The ambient hum of the overhead air conditioning seemed unnaturally loud. Every eye shifted toward the elevated bench. Judge Harrison sat perfectly still. He looked at the defense attorney. He looked at the two disgraced men sitting at the defense table. He looked at Richard and Beatrice, praying in the gallery. Then he looked at me, sitting calmly beside Naomi. The judge reached forward and picked up his wooden gavel. He raised it in the air. The sharp crack of the wood striking the sounding block echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Richard flinched. Liam squeezed his eyes shut. I have presided over this family court for 2 decades. Judge Harrison began his voice, a low, resonant rumble. I have untangled bitter disputes, mediated complex corporate divisions, and prioritized the welfare of countless minors. The mandate of this court is to ensure the equitable division of marital assets. He paused, placing the gavel down and resting his hands on the thick blue binder containing the civil divorce filings. But equity requires a foundation of legal ownership. The judge continued his tone, hardening into cold steel. A family court cannot divide assets that were procured through international money laundering. A family court cannot allocate funds that belong to a federal charity for disabled veterans. And a family court certainly cannot award a financial stipend to an undocumented foreign national actively plotting to poison his spouse to seize control of a corporate holding company. Richard let out a hollow, breathless sound. His hands slipped from the wooden pew. The minor stipend he was praying for, the financial lifeline he needed to save his mansion, vanished into thin air. I cannot issue a ruling on this dissolution today, Judge Harrison announced. The civil jurisdiction of this court has been superseded by the sheer volume of organized criminal activity presented during these proceedings. The defense attorney frowned, looking up in sudden confusion. Your Honor, he stammered. If you dismiss the civil case, my client retains his legal marital status pending a formal criminal trial. Judge Harrison did not respond to the attorney. He closed the thick blue binder securing the clasp. He slid the civil file to the far edge of his desk, pushing it away as if it were contaminated. The judge looked past the defense table, locking his eyes directly onto the woman sitting beside me. We are concluded here, Counselor Judge Harrison. stated, offering a slow, respectful nod. "The floor is yours." The defense attorney turned his head, staring at our table in utter bewilderment. Liam opened his eyes, a fresh wave of panic washing over his pale features. They did not understand why a family court judge was yielding the floor to an opposing divorce lawyer after officially suspending the trial. Naomi stood up. She did not pick up a legal notepad. She did not reach for her electronic tablet or the laser pointer. She reached for the top button of her charcoal suit jacket. With slow, deliberate movements, Naomi unbuttoned the tailored jacket. She slipped it off her shoulders, folding it neatly and draping it over the back of her wooden chair. She stood in the center of the courtroom, wearing a crisp white blouse and a dark tailored skirt. Caleb gasped, shrinking back in his seat. Liam leaned forward, his jaw dropping. Fastened securely to the leather waistband of her skirt, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, was a heavy bronze shield. It was not a generic security badge. It was a precise, unmistakable emblem of federal authority. The engraved lettering curved around the center star, declaring her true allegiance. Department of Justice. Naomi rested her hand near the badge, projecting an aura of total, inescapable dominance. She did not look like a private litigator negotiating alimony payments. She looked like the apex predator of the American legal system. "You seem confused." Counselor Naomi noted her voice, dropping its polite courtroom cadence, replacing it with a sharp, unyielding edge. "Allow me to clarify the structural dynamics of this afternoon. I left private divorce practice 4 years ago. My current title is Special Assistant to the United States Attorney General, operating under the White Collar Crime and Public Corruption Task Force." The defense attorney legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, gripping his chest as he stared at the bronze shield. He had spent the entire day arguing against a federal prosecutor. Securing a grand jury indictment for international money laundering, corporate espionage, and immigration fraud is a tedious process, Naomi explained, pacing slowly toward the defense table. It requires months of meticulous discovery. White-collar criminals hide behind shell companies. They encrypt their hard drives. They route their stolen funds through offshore tax havens. If the Department of Justice had knocked on your front door with a standard search warrant, you would have shredded the documents and fled the jurisdiction. She stopped mere feet away from Liam and Caleb. "We needed a faster method to secure your confessions," Naomi stated, her piercing gaze pinning them to their chairs. "We needed you to lower your defenses. And there is no environment more conducive to reckless arrogance than a high-net-worth family court. We knew that if we dangled a $400 million real estate empire in front of you, your greed would blind you to the risk." Richard and Beatrice sat frozen in the gallery, their grand aristocratic illusions entirely eradicated. They were not watching a divorce. They were watching a federal execution. "You walked into this room voluntarily," Naomi continued, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of a prison sentence. "You submitted forged legal documents into the public record voluntarily. You admitted to faking a marriage for immigration purposes on a hot microphone. You forwarded a cyber extortion threat directly to a federal agent. We did not need to hunt you down to gather evidence. We simply set a trap, padded it with the promise of unearned wealth, and waited for you to lock yourselves inside." Naomi turned her back on the broken men, looking up at the judge. "The civil trial is officially terminated," Naomi declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "This room is now a federal holding facility." The bronze shield fastened to Naomi's skirt caught the stark fluorescent light illuminating the precise engraved lettering of the Department of Justice. The sheer weight of that metal emblem hung in the stagnant air, obliterating the final remnants of the civil divorce proceeding. The defense attorney representing Liam did not attempt to mount a counter-argument. He did not cite jurisdictional statutes or demand a sidebar with the judge. He possessed the survival instinct of a seasoned legal practitioner. He recognized that its client had just confessed to federal immigration fraud on a live audio record while simultaneously being implicated in racketeering and extortion. The attorney slowly closed his empty leather briefcase, snapped the brass lock shut, and took a deliberate physical step away from the defense table. He severed his professional association in real time, leaving the disgraced men to face the full, unmitigated force of the federal government. Richard stood up from the gallery pew. His pristine, tailored suit seemed to hang off his frame like a discarded shell. For 3 decades, my father had carefully molded his public image around a concept of untouchable patriarchal authority. He had groomed Caleb to inherit the global logistics empire, excusing his failing academic grades, his reckless financial behavior, and his profound lack of ambition. Richard viewed a male heir as the ultimate status symbol, a necessary requirement to maintain their elite standing among the wealthy families of Fairfield County. He had handed his son the keys to the kingdom, believing Caleb would secure their legacy. He realized with crushing clarity that his golden child had just used those very keys to unlock a massive federal racketeering indictment that would seize every asset bearing the family name. Richard did not project the dignified aura of a shipping magnate as he bypassed the wooden gate separating the spectators from the legal floor. He moved with the blind, frantic energy of a cornered predator whose territory had just been set ablaze. He marched directly toward the defense table, his face twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered fury. He reached Caleb before the court bailiffs could even step forward to intercept him. Richard raised his right hand and brought it across his son's face with a sickening, resonant crack. The impact of the slap spun my brother around. Caleb lost his footing entirely, crashing heavily against the solid mahogany table before tumbling onto the hardwood floor. "You parasitic fool!" Richard roared his voice, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, stripping away any lingering illusion of courtroom decorum. He stood over his son, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the ruined man, gasping on the floor. "You forged my signature on a commercial promissory note. You pledged my primary residence to a shadow lender. You looked me in the eye and told me you needed a simple financial guarantor for a minor startup venture. You swore the paperwork was a standard corporate formality. You stole my entire legacy to fund your sick delusions, and now the government is going to seize my shipping firm. I am ruined because of you." Caleb scrambled backward, pressing his spine against the heavy wooden legs of the defense table. His expensive beige suit was wrinkled and stained with the accumulated dust of the courtroom floor. He had spent his entire life shielded by his parents' wealth, never facing a single tangible consequence for his destructive actions. Now staring down a mandatory minimum decade in a federal penitentiary, his instinct was to deflect accountability. He looked at his father, his eyes wide with raw terror, and then he thrust a pointing finger directly at the man sitting in the adjacent chair. "He made me do it!" Caleb sobbed, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his impending arrest. Liam drafted the power of attorney documents. He found the hard money lender. Liam knew Victoria was auditing the joint marital accounts, and he needed untraceable cash to maintain his luxury lifestyle. He manipulated me. He planted the idea of the medical conservatorship. He bought the antipsychotic medication to drug her. I did not want to hurt anyone. He told me we would lose everything if I did not secure the capital immediately. Liam threw his hands in the air, stepping quickly away from the shattered remnants of his romantic partnership. The boyish charm and manufactured grief he had weaponized for 5 years vanished without a trace, leaving a cold, desperate grifter fully exposed. "I manipulated you," Liam countered, a harsh, manic laugh escaping his throat as he glared down at Caleb. "You are a delusional sociopath. You orchestrated the Deepfake extortion video on your own. You logged into your father's commercial server because you thought you were a genius hacker. You hired your own ex-girlfriend to carry a stranger baby just to siphon more corporate health insurance funds. I was just a passenger in your twisted criminal scheme. You used my marriage as a bank account." Liam realized the blame game was his only remaining defense mechanism. He pivoted sharply, facing Richard and Beatrice. My mother had rushed to the wooden partition, clutching her pearls, her face pale and contorted with shock. Liam directed his wrath at his in-laws, refusing to sink alone. "And you two are the architects of this entire disaster," Liam shouted, his voice rising to a frantic pitch as he pointed at the stunned couple. You sat in your exclusive country club dining rooms, demanding I keep your daughter in line. You pressured me to extract more wealth from her so you could maintain your hollow social standing among your elite friends. You provided the secure internet network for the forged signatures. You handed Caleb the server bypass codes to run his digital blackmail operations. You bred this greedy monster, and now you expect me to take the fall to protect your rotten family name. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, devastating shriek, utterly denying the accusations. She leaned over the wooden railing and swung her heavy designer handbag, striking Liam squarely on the shoulder. Richard lunged forward, grabbing his son-in-law by the collar of his tailored shirt. The three of them collided in a chaotic, desperate physical struggle. The pristine, aristocratic family descended into a pack of feral animals right in front of the judge. The loyalty they had boasted about the bloodline they claimed was sacred proved to be a cheap, fragile veneer. The moment their freedom and their wealth were threatened, they turned on each other with breathtaking speed, tearing into flesh and reputation to survive. I sat calmly at the plaintiff table, observing the spectacular carnage. I did not feel a shred of pity or residual familial affection. I watched the people who had treated me as a disposable asset cannibalize themselves. Naomi stood beside me, her arms crossed, watching the implosion with the clinical detachment of a scientist, recording a volatile chemical reaction. We did not need to raise our voices or hurl insults to achieve victory. The trap we built had functioned flawlessly, utilizing their own boundless greed and entitlement as the primary mechanisms of their total destruction. Liam broke free from Richard's grip, tearing the seam of his custom shirt in the process. His chest heaved as he stumbled backward, gasping for air. He looked at the two federal marshals flanking the defense table, who were now speaking quietly into their wrist communicators. He looked at the bronze badge resting on Naomi's skirt. He realized that arguing over who engineered the fraud was entirely pointless. The Department of Justice did not care who initiated the crimes. They were all going to a federal penitentiary, and his green card was permanently revoked. His American dream, the life of luxury he had stolen, was dead. The survival instinct of a cornered fugitive overwhelmed his remaining logic. The rational part of his brain shut down, entirely replaced by an overwhelming, primal urge to escape the room. Liam spun around. He shoved past the bewildered court bailiff stationed near the gallery aisle. He broke into a dead sprint, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor before finding traction. He darted through the rows of wooden pews, heading straight for the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom. The marshals shouted a stern warning, commanding him to halt, but Liam did not slow his pace. He reached the exit, his hands slamming against the brass push bar with frantic, desperate energy. He threw his entire body weight into the doors, expecting to burst out into the freedom of the expansive corridor. The heavy wood swung outward. Liam stumbled forward onto the threshold, but his momentum halted instantly, as if he had run headfirst into a solid brick wall. He froze, his eyes widening as he stared into the hallway. A tactical squad of immigration and customs enforcement agents wearing heavy dark body armor stood shoulder to shoulder with armed United States Marshals. They held their positions in perfect silence, blocking the entire width of the corridor. Their hands rested firmly on their tactical utility belts, forming an impenetrable human barricade that cut off the final desperate breath of his freedom. The tactical squad did not issue a second warning. As Liam stared into the human barricade of federal agents, his survival instinct short-circuited. He took a hesitant step backward, but the space behind him was already occupied. Two United States Marshals flanked him, driving his shoulders downward with practiced efficiency. Liam hit the polished marble floor hard. The heavy thud of his impact echoed through the stunned chamber, vibrating against the wooden pews. He kicked his expensive leather shoes against the stone, attempting to twist his body, but the officers pinned his wrists firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs cut through the ambient noise, sealing his fate. He was hauled upright, his breathing ragged and shallow. The federal agents did not treat him like a wealthy corporate spouse or a privileged socialite. They processed him as a dangerous flight risk, facing severe federal immigration fraud and corporate espionage charges. His tailored Italian suit was scuffed with dirt, his boyish charm replaced by the vacant stare of a ruined man. The physical takedown of my former husband brought a chilling, suffocating silence over the gallery. Richard and Beatrice stood frozen near the wooden partition, holding their breath. They watched Liam being dragged away, expecting the chaos to subside once the undocumented grifter was removed. They assumed their status as wealthy spectators would shield them from the immediate fallout. They still clung to the delusion that their old money lineage granted them immunity from the consequences of their actions. Naomi shattered that delusion with surgical precision. She signaled a secondary team of agents stationed near the side entrance of the chamber. The officers approached the front pew, holding thick manila envelopes sealed with official red wax. Naomi walked forward, her Department of Justice badge catching the harsh overhead light. She stopped directly in front of the wooden gate, holding the top envelope out to my father. Richard took the document, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He broke the wax seal and scanned the dense legal text. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving a hollow gray mask of pure terror. Beatrice leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the page, trying to comprehend the complex legal terminology. "That is a civil asset forfeiture mandate," Naomi stated, her voice echoing with lethal, unyielding authority. By knowingly providing the digital infrastructure for federal cyber extortion, you transformed Vance Global Imports from a legitimate logistics firm into a host network for organized crime. The Department of Justice has officially initiated operations under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the text in his hands. As of 10 minutes ago, federal agents entered your corporate headquarters in Fairfield. Naomi continued delivering the execution order without a shred of sympathy. They secured the server rooms. They locked down the executive suites. They confiscated the shipping manifests. The federal government now controls your entire business operation. You are no longer the chief executive officer, Richard. You are a suspect in a racketeering syndicate. Beatrice gasped, clutching her throat. "Our accounts?" She whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile sound breaking the heavy silence. Frozen Naomi confirmed her gaze, locking onto my mother. "Every domestic checking account, every offshore trust, and every investment portfolio tied to your Social Security numbers is currently seized pending a comprehensive forensic audit. The hard money lender will foreclose on your primary residence at dawn tomorrow. The property taxes on your secondary holdings remain unpaid. You possess zero liquid capital. You are carrying millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. You walk out of this courthouse today with nothing but the clothes on your backs." The aristocratic fortress Richard had spent decades building collapsed in a matter of seconds. He dropped the legal mandate. The heavy paper fluttered to the floor, landing near his polished shoes. He swayed on his feet, a broken man stripped of the only metric he used to measure human worth. His country club memberships, his private golf outings, and his elite social standing evaporated, leaving him destitute and facing federal scrutiny. Across the room, Caleb remained cornered near the shattered defense table. He watched the financial destruction of his parents, recognizing his own insulation was entirely gone. A senior federal investigator approached him, holding a matching pair of heavy steel restraints. Caleb did not fight. The adrenaline that fueled his earlier physical altercation had drained away, leaving a hollow, trembling coward. He held out his hands, surrendering to the inevitable. The heavy cuffs bit into his wrists, bunching the fabric of his tailored beige suit against the rigid metal chain. Caleb Vance, the investigator, announced, reciting the charges with mechanical detachment. "You are under federal arrest. The grand jury indictment includes multiple counts of interstate bank fraud, aggravated identity theft wire extortion, and conspiracy to commit premeditated poisoning." The list of severe felonies hung in the sterile air of the courtroom. The sheer volume of the criminality silenced any remaining whispers. The judge sat behind the bench, watching the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. The family court clerk recorded the final notes of a dissolution that had morphed into a sweeping criminal takedown. The Vance family name was no longer synonymous with high society galas and corporate influence. It was a permanent cautionary tale of greed, entitlement, and federal incarceration. The bailiffs secured the perimeter as the tactical agents began the process of removing the prisoners from the floor. They marched Liam out through the rear exit, his head bowed in total defeat, a ghost destined for a concrete cell before permanent deportation. The officers then turned their attention to my brother, gripping his arms and guiding him toward the central aisle. Their path led directly past the plaintiff table. I remained seated, observing the procession with clinical detachment. As the agents hauled Caleb past my position, his fragile composure finally shattered. The reality of a maximum security federal penitentiary broke his mind. He planted his expensive leather shoes against the marble, fighting the forward momentum of the officers. He twisted his upper body toward me, tears streaming down his bruised face. The arrogant grifter who had orchestrated a $5 million digital blackmail scheme just an hour ago was reduced to a sobbing, pathetic shell. "Victoria, please." Caleb wept, his voice raw and desperate. He ignored the federal agents tugging at his arms. "Look at me. We share the same blood. We grew up in the same house. You cannot let them lock me away in a cage. I will sign whatever you want. I will confess to everything. Just talk to the prosecutors. Tell them to show mercy. You are my sister." He played the ultimate emotional card, relying on the biological connection he had weaponized for his entire existence. He expected a flicker of hesitation. He anticipated a final moment of sibling solidarity, hoping the ghost of our childhood would save him from the consequences of his treason. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not avert my gaze or display a fraction of an ounce of pity. I looked down at the polished mahogany floor near the defense table. During the violent physical altercation between Liam and Caleb, the crying infant had dropped a small item. A pale blue silicone pacifier lay discarded on the hardwood surface near the splintered chairs. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my navy blazer. I walked over to the dropped pacifier and picked it up. I approached Caleb, invading his personal space, while the federal agents held him secure. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading hope. He genuinely thought I was approaching to offer a lifeline to stop the agents and negotiate his release. I reached out and shoved the silicone pacifier deep into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. I patted the expensive fabric, ensuring the item sat securely against his chest. I leaned forward, bringing my face inches from his ear. "Enjoy fatherhood behind bars." I whispered my tone, a cold, fatal breeze against his skin. I stepped back, offering a brief, sharp nod to the federal investigator. The officers hauled my brother forward, breaking his resistance. Caleb let out a devastating, hollow wail that echoed down the long marble corridor as the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, locking his final shred of pride in absolute dark. 6 months evaporate quickly when you govern an international supply chain, but the federal justice system operates on a timeline of excruciating consequence. Liam stood before a federal judge in a lower Manhattan courthouse, stripped of his tailored Italian linen and his unearned swagger. He wore the standard-issue khaki uniform of an immigration detainee. The high-priced defense attorneys abandoned him the moment his fraudulent hard money loan defaulted. Relying on state-appointed public defenders, Liam could not negotiate a single plea deal. The prosecution did not need to build a complex narrative. They simply played the audio recordings of his extortion plots in open court and presented the offshore routing logs extracted directly from his mobile device. The judge handed down a sentence of 12 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The strike of the wooden gavel carried a secondary lethal mandate. Upon completion of his federal sentence, Liam will face immediate and permanent deportation. The American dream he attempted to steal dissolved into a concrete cell and a one-way ticket to a country he abandoned decades ago. His green card is shredded. He will leave prison in his late 40s with no wealth, no family, and no legal status anywhere on the continent. Caleb met an equally severe fate in a neighboring federal courtroom. During his trial, my younger brother attempted to play the naive, manipulated victim, blaming his partner for orchestrating the entire cyber extortion scheme. He sobbed on the witness stand, hoping his tears would sway the jury and invoke their pity. The prosecutors bypassed his emotional theater entirely. They projected the deepfake video he rendered on his father's corporate servers onto the courtroom monitors, followed by the decrypted chat logs where he gleefully coordinated my forced psychiatric hold. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Caleb received a 15-year sentence for wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy without the possibility of early parole. The man who once threw tantrums over delayed allowance deposits now lives in an 8 by 10-foot concrete enclosure. His daily routine is dictated by armed guards and steel doors. His designer wardrobe is permanently replaced by scratchy, state-issued cotton. The silicone pacifier I tucked into his pocket remains the only physical reminder of the fabricated legacy he sacrificed his freedom to build. My parents suffered a destruction that, to their status, obsessed minds, was a fate far worse than federal incarceration. The Department of Justice executed the civil asset forfeiture mandates with ruthless precision. The sprawling Fairfield estate, funded by decades of questionable corporate practices and shell entities, was seized by the government and auctioned to a commercial developer. The bank foreclosed on their remaining secondary properties to cover the balloon payments Liam had triggered. Richard and Beatrice were evicted from their aristocratic fortress with only the clothes on their backs and a few personal items stuffed into cardboard boxes. They relocated to a cramped, drafty, one-bedroom apartment in a decaying, subsidized housing project on the outskirts of the city. The elite social circle they had worshipped turned their backs instantly. The Wellington Equestrian and Golf Society formally erased their names from the founding charter, treating them like a contagion. Dinner invitations ceased. When Beatrice tried to call her wealthy friends for emergency loans, her number was universally blocked. The women who used to sip mimosas in her manicured gardens now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Richard attempted to secure consulting work to pay their mounting legal bills, but his public association with a federal racketeering investigation rendered him permanently unemployable. They now survive on a meager government stipend, eating cheap, canned meals, while listening to the constant wail of police sirens outside their thin windows. The paint on their apartment walls is peeling. The heating system rattles throughout the night. Richard's psychological state fractured under the weight of his new reality. He refuses to leave the apartment, terrified someone from his past might see him wearing thrift store clothing. They traded their entire legacy to protect a fraudster, and the transaction left them destitute. I did not attend the sentencing hearings. I did not visit them in their squalid apartment to gloat over their misery. I spent those 6 months fortifying the empire they tried to steal. Tonight, the air inside my Manhattan penthouse is cool and perfectly regulated. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer an unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. The noise of the chaotic streets below cannot penetrate the thick, soundproof glass. I stand near the edge of the living room, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The pale liquid catches the ambient light of the room, a quiet testament to the battles fought and won. The silence in my home is not born of isolation. It is a fiercely guarded peace, constructed from the ashes of their betrayal. The heavy oak door of the penthouse opens. Naomi strides into the room, bringing the crisp, electrified energy of the financial district with her. She loosens the collar of her silk blouse after a long day of navigating the highest echelons of corporate law. She walks over to the wet bar, pours herself a glass of champagne, and joins me near the windows. She does not carry a legal briefcase today. She carries victory. The acquisitions cleared regulatory oversight this afternoon, Naomi announces, her deep voice resonating with quiet satisfaction. The blind trust successfully absorbed 2 of our primary competitors. We acquired their logistics infrastructure for pennies on the dollar after the market panicked over the Vance Global Imports racketeering scandal. Your holding company now controls a dominant 65% market share in the medical supply sector. The board of directors at the new subsidiaries voted unanimously to adopt your supply chain algorithms. I nod, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my drink. We had weaponized the fallout. When the federal arrest of my brother sent shockwaves through the shipping sector, vulnerable companies scrambled for stability. My firm provided that stability, swooping in to buy distressed assets while our competitors were busy trying to untangle their legal liabilities. The Department of Justice investigation provided the perfect smokescreen, allowing my trust to maneuver through the market undetected. We turned a domestic assassination attempt into a multi-billion-dollar corporate expansion. The woman they had openly despised was now dictating market terms across the globe. I look out over the sprawling grid of light and steel stretching toward the horizon. Society pushes a dangerous, deeply flawed narrative about familial obligation. We are conditioned to believe that sharing genetic material requires us to endure endless manipulation, financial drain, and emotional degradation. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to keep the peace at holiday dinners. But peace built on subjugation is just a different kind of prison. Blood is merely a biological accident. Respect, unwavering loyalty, and clear boundaries are the true defining metrics of a family. A shared last name does not grant anyone the right to siphon your wealth or compromise your safety. The people standing in this penthouse earned their place through action, not mere biology. My biological relatives viewed me as a disposable asset, a corporate machine they could easily erase to secure their own luxury. They thought they could ignite a fire under my life and walk away unscathed. They failed to understand a fundamental rule of survival. You never set a woman on fire and expect her not to burn down your entire kingdom. I rest my hand against the cool glass of the window, watching the city pulse with life. The enemies who tried to destroy me are buried beneath the ash of their own staggering arrogance, locked in concrete cells and decaying apartments. Their voices are silenced forever. Meanwhile, the empire I built from the dirt they despised is only just beginning to rise. I turn away from the panoramic glass of my penthouse, leaving the glittering Manhattan skyline to the night. The war is officially closed. The quiet atmosphere in my home does not stem from isolation. It is a pristine, fiercely guarded peace. I constructed a thriving stronghold from the very soil my relatives mocked, burying their arrogance in the process. Looking back at the wreckage of their fabricated dynasty, 3 distinct principles emerge from the ashes of that family courtroom. First, biology is merely a genetic coincidence, not a binding contract. Society conditions us to endure mistreatment under the guise of familial duty, urging us to keep the peace at all costs. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a bloodline. But true loyalty must be earned, never assumed. When the individuals who share your last name view you as nothing more than a disposable resource to fund their delusions, severing that tie is not an act of betrayal. It is a vital, necessary amputation required to save your own future. You owe zero allegiance to people who actively plot your demise. Second silence serves as the most lethal instrument in any confrontation. When faced with overt hostility or extortion, human instinct urges you to scream, to demand an apology, or to vigorously defend your worth. I chose the exact opposite approach. I offered them absolute silence. I watched them submit their forged signatures and present their fake tears to a federal judge. Let arrogant adversaries speak. Let them boast and formulate their schemes. While they waste precious energy maintaining a fragile illusion, you gather the hard data. You map their financial vulnerabilities, secure the digital footprints, and strike only when the legal checkmate is mathematically guaranteed. The third and final truth is that genuine retribution does not require you to descend into the mud. You do not engage in petty, emotional brawls with parasites. You outgrow the threat entirely. You build an enterprise so vast and impenetrable that their malicious attempts to ruin you barely register as a microscopic tremor against your foundation. My victory was not defined merely by placing fraudsters in federal holding cells or foreclosing on their mansions. It was defined by multiplying my net worth, seizing their market share, and securing a generational legacy they can never touch. They mistook my calm, measured demeanor for weakness. They assumed a woman dedicated to her corporate empire lacked the instinct to protect herself. They learned far too late that the most dangerous predator in the room is the one who never makes a tritia single sound until the steel trap snaps shut. Have you ever encountered individuals who severely underestimated your intellect, only to watch them orchestrate their own spectacular downfall? Share your experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories for more narratives of calculated, uncompromising justice. Never let anyone dictate your value, and always remember your silence is your sharpest weapon.